releases, like many online games do in the days after launch. This would lead to many people being out of their 2-hour refund window, perhaps without even getting into the game to play in the first place. It would be like buying a new television advertised as 65 inches, only to take it out of the box and realise it was 16 inches, then being told you cannot get a refund because you unboxed it, where, without doing so, you wouldn't have personally been able to attest to the fact it wasn't as advertised, just like the players who didn't get to try the game wouldn't know either. This led to people, rightfully so, asking Valve to step in, especially when the next news hit Fantastic's Twitter. Now it's important to note here, personally, I was one of the biggest critics of Fantastic in the day before, but not even I could have expected this. Never in my years of covering or following the games industry had I ever seen anything like this. Just hours after the financial leaks began to circulate, it was all over, much faster than it started. Today we announced the closure of Fantastic Studio. Unfortunately, the day before has failed financially and we lack the funds to continue. All income received is being used to pay off debts to our partners. The message continued by declaring that Fantastic had taken no money during development the day before, which was entirely irrelevant since they now had over 100,000 copies sold on a game that they had immediately, within 5 days, abandoned. If you thought this bonfire was already burning, with people calling them a scam all over the internet, now this was like pouring gasoline on that fire. Everybody was adamant that they'd stolen the money, that they planned this from the very beginning, that they'd just turn around and ran away as soon as that money had cleared. After all, how else could you explain what had happened? Who closes a video game studio 5 days after launching a game? After all, taking people's money, closing your studio immediately, and then saying you're going to use their money to pay debts, what other options are there? And realistically, everybody knows you don't wake up one day and realise you have no money. Clearly the only reason the day before launched after over a year of delays was that this was the Hail Mary, that they were now out of money and they needed this launch. They were just out of opportunity to continue the charade. No more time to try and get the game into a better state. It was now or never. They knew this, and yet days before the release they were saying we're here for the long term, we're going to keep updating. A way to try and placate, to try and convince people to stick around, even if it was rough at the beginning. What other reason does this exist other than to try and make money? Clearly if they didn't launch now, they would have gone bankrupt without ever launching, so instead of calling it quits, admitting the product was not fit for purpose, an actual disgrace to try and sell this to their fans, they just launched it for $30 per copy. And the charitable interpretation is to speculate that they were hoping they were wrong, that their own game was fun enough for some people to play and enjoy. But having done so myself, subjected myself to playing the day before, can't imagine who delusionally the company thought they would have anything beyond a tiny initial bump out of curiosity, followed by an immediate nosedive with refunds and accusations. After all, they had 3 years to prepare them for what the public was already saying. Things that they knew the public thought about them in the game. Add in that they knew behind the scenes the final jigsaw piece was this, that left no doubt that this game was going to be a spectacular failure. So when faced with the decision, abandon and get nothing or release and ride off into the sunset with something, they decided that they were going to cash in. A decision that almost certainly would have resulted in legal action had this ended here. But this story isn't quite over. 12 minutes after the studio closure announcement, quote, "This was our first big experience. Shit happens." So let's remember real quick what they mean when they say shit happens. The game was misrepresented for over 3 years, repeatedly moved the goalposts of launch, multiple times said they'd let people play the game and then never did, launched into early access for a high box price for a product that was not only utterly broken, but devoid of content or fun, and we're now hand-waving it away as if this is just something that happens to you, and not a long list of very intentional decisions that were made, leading us to this very moment. They were then even community noted during this Twitter thread when they claimed that the game was entirely their work. This note pointed to a Reddit thread that dissected just how much of the day before was pre-made, store-bought assets. Which now brought this whole situation to a close. The only thing remaining was for the day before to make good on their promise to be a revolutionary game, to do things that no other game had done before. This came on December 12th, when Steam decided to remove the restrictions for refunds from the day before, essentially opening the ability to get a full refund no matter the circumstance. But it didn't even end there, as people continued to make very valid points that some users would not see these announcements, would not post even more refund requests if they were denied before, instead leaving Fantastic to escape with some of the customer funds, pointing out that even a single penny would be more than they deserved for what they had done with the day before. Luckily, Steam saw this and agreed. They then took a measure that could be the first in their history, proactively refunding every single purchase of the game, even if it was not requested. Basically wiping the stain of the day before from their platform once and for all, even giving up their own cut of money owed for the sales of the product. Making good on Fantastic's promise that the day before would make history, just in an unexpected way. With that, it seems that the story of the day before is over. Many people maintain their position that the day before is the biggest scam game ever created. A trailer that went viral, making it much bigger than it ever had any right to be. A developer that mismanaged every aspect of public relations, misleading them for years for a product that never truly existed. Showing trailers of a game that never materialized. Baiting and switching with products to try and cash in on their reputation before delivering anything of substance. And then being caught provably lying on several occasions. Without a shadow of a doubt, the day before irreparably harmed the games industry, especially the trust that people place in indie game developers and early access as a vehicle for the delivery of games that are not quite ready but need that support. A model that has produced many fantastic games, but has also been misused by people just like Fantastic. For what happened in the end, nobody got anything, except for this story, one of the most ridiculous in gaming, until someone comes along and does something worse, if that's even possible. There are still questions that remain unanswered, ones that likely will remain that way. After all, every decision made in this epic saga could have been avoided, and I always go back and forth on whether things like this are actual scams, and which definition people are using when they say that word. In a legal sense that you could prove in court, I cannot say, but in the sense that we all understand as consumers, there is no doubt what the day before became. But the more interesting question is, what was it when it began? Because there is no argument to be made that Fantastic didn't intentionally mislead customers as a matter of habit, that they made decisions to sweep issues under the rug, that they also cut their losses immediately at the end. If you were unfamiliar with the finer details, it might be easy to describe this as a studio getting more hype than they were ever ready or capable of handling, that their little game outgrew their abilities, that they just got in over their heads, which led to a hole being dug deeper and deeper as time went on, with no way to climb out before they reached 6 feet. But that narrative conveniently ignores that at every step of the way, this studio leveraged the attention that they received to try and profit, usually from misrepresentations, obfuscations, or outright lies. In the end, the comparison between what was shown and what was sold, despite years of additional work, makes the entire situation impossible to give the benefit of the doubt or a charitable interpretation. The release of the day before was missing almost every small feature that they painstakingly displayed during earlier trailers, leaving behind what many will go on to call the biggest scam in Steam's history. And that is the end of this story.
It was a good coverage, yeah. The best on the market.
Or at least it should have been. But with these brothers in charge, it's possible that the story will one day be in need of another lengthy update, as despite the day before shutting down officially on the 22nd of January, a date that is no doubt passed by the time you see this video, and the studio officially shut down weeks prior to that, it seems that the brothers are not done.
Oh, it's
and
Dark
if sources
Elemental.
from seedaction.pl are to be trusted, they were never planning to be done in the first place. You see, according to multiple publications, even months prior to the official release and disaster of the day before, the brothers had already begun another video game development project. They were quietly gathering the most veteran in their studio to begin work on this other project, even some of the employees who were fired or quit due to the horrible working conditions under what many refer to as the most incompetent, clueless bosses in the games industry. Which means, for months, they were already planning their escape from underneath the weight of the day before and Fantastic the studio. That they likely knew the game was going to be such an incredible flop and were planning for that inevitability. With the financial well running dry and the game in such a terrible state, they made plans to move on before it had even run its course. Which, as a callback to the letter we read earlier claiming that those who spoke out were spreading disinformation, how they were planning to help other game developers, and of course the later letter that promises future updates to the game for the long term, are yet more lies, designed as it seems to try and prop up as many sales as possible for a product they knew was insufficient and were planning to abandon, just like every other project they'd released previously, proving that what they called disinformation was in fact accurate. Looking at the history of the studio and the brothers did lead to an accurate prediction of the future of this studio. On top of that, in a story that seemingly never ends, even when there should be nothing left to mismanage, the brothers refused to let it go, refused to take even the minimum responsibility for what became of their flagship and studio destroying game. January 24th, 2 days after the official closure of the day before and Prop Night servers, Fantastic took to Twitter in order to set the record straight once and for all. They claimed again that they didn't scam anyone because they returned all money raised from selling the game, even going so far as to point out how few companies would ever do the same, neglecting of course how few companies would ever be in this position in the first place. The obvious issue with this is that, as we pointed out in the video previously, Fantastic never had a penny of players' money to return. Instead, it was all held by Valve the entire time, meaning it's not them who chose to return the funds, but Valve through the Steam platform. Now, whether or not Fantastic made this decision independently of Valve is something we can never know, but judging from their closure letter that came out on December 12th, stating they were going to use all the money raised to pay back debts, it does seem like their initial choice was to take the money, making whatever they say now contradictory and also impossible to look at with good faith. While everyone getting a refund is good, they are not to be applauded for eventually being forced into coming to the right decision only when the consequences of their actions became clear. When you have no real choice but to do the right thing, you don't get brownie points for doing it, and that's even if we assume you made the choice and not Valve on your behalf. The next part of the statement, they say they delivered on all aspects of the trailer in the final game, but go on to immediately contradict themselves with things that they'd left out, as well as ignoring the very clear video evidence on display that illustrates this point is completely false even on the face of it. But all of that pales in comparison to the end, where they essentially blame people such as myself, YouTubers and streamers for making their game fail, claiming that we made so many people hate the game by just telling them what was happening and what the company had done that it was never going to succeed.
No.
Ignoring that games which are good will always strip users of their preconceived ideas, and they'll choose to consume the product regardless of what came before, so long as the product is good enough to do so. Meaning if people chose not to play the day before, it was purely because the game wasn't good. And that ignores the objective data, with hundreds of thousands of users buying the game on release, of which over half of them refunded the game within a day, and the player numbers dropped to almost nothing within days of the game standing on its own 2 feet for the very first time. No amount of giving your opinion on whether or not a game will be good, or whether a game is good, or telling people what happened with the company prior to release, will stop people playing a good game. That's simply not how things work. Essentially, Fantastic refuse, even now, in the face of all the data, in the face of all the reviews, to acknowledge that they released a game that had zero redeeming qualities. Instead, choosing to blame anyone and everything except for themselves. The funny part here is that in true Fantastic fashion, this Twitter nonsense didn't just begin and end with silly, easy to disprove rhetoric. That would have been too straightforward. A few hours after this post was made, it had been community noted. This note called the game a scam and disproved the statements made regarding the features being complete and early to release with a video. This video comprehensively shows what was missing from the game that was shown previously in the trailers, proving beyond a doubt that even the basics of Fantastic's new claims were incorrect. Fantastic decided the best course of action to resolve the situation was to simply delete the Twitter post, removing that community note, and then wait a few hours and repost, essentially hiding the evidence once more and trying to continue their PR spin without people calling them out. I'm not sure why they thought this would work, because the Twitter post was community noted again within a few hours, this time calling them out for deleting the post trying to avoid the note in the first place. Essentially making it much worse, showing that they were trying to hide this, because the note was exactly the same, identical. Now clearly this wasn't going the way Fantastic wanted, and they didn't like the idea of public consensus and evidence being present with their public statements. So they deleted the post again, then changed their Twitter bio to a bunch of red arrows pointing to a link, which sent you to their repurposed website. This website now hosts their statements in its entirety, only now devoid of the ability to be challenged by facts or public opinion. But just when I thought...
Excuse me. Oh, I want to get something to drink, I forgot, but I also want to monitor this fight because it's been going on for a while. Yeah, we're okay. Takes so long to do anything. I'm asleep, that son of a bitch. Yeah, it's fine. Excuse me. Excuse me.
That this story was over, in what has become the 4th edit during production of the video, we finally got some answers as to what exactly happened for the day before to become known as the biggest scam in Steam's history. On February 1st, 2024, German game site and YouTube channels Game2 and GameStar posted a documentary featuring an extensive investigation into Fantastic, including interviews with dozens of former staff and volunteers from both Fantastic the developer and Mytona the publisher. The findings align with much of what was reported during the initial Russian language leaks discussed earlier in this video, but also answers some of the questions raised throughout the journey. PC Gamer also did a write-up in English based on this video. Both will be linked in the video description. To begin with, all of the blame for what the day before became is firmly at the feet of the brothers. Game2 sources point out that they were taken by whatever idea or trend they discovered on any given day or week, changing the direction of, design or implementation of almost every aspect of the day before on a whim. This wasn't even limited to just small areas or decisions, but entire art styles and systems. The examples given were the character creator, which was overhauled every time the brothers played a new game. First with it needing to keep up with the GTA Online character creator, then Hogwarts Legacy, then Baldur's Gate 3. Whatever was trending, the brothers wanted their small game, their small team, to make it like that, or better. Next came the city that the players would be exploring. First it was supposed to fit the genre, a gritty, dark, realistic to the setting place, and then later to a brighter, almost cheery vibe like that of Spider-Man 2. And you can see this shift from earlier trailers to the final release. Of course, we all know the entire game changed because internally when they began developing the day before, it was supposed to be a small co-op game. Which is important context when you hear this next piece of information. The most insane and ridiculous part of this entire investigation was that it revealed
your skill has increased.
The audience was not the only people shocked by the scope and scale of the game from an unknown developer. In fact, the developers themselves were more shocked than we were. According to this report, the day before developers, as in the people working for the brothers and making the video game, only learned that the game was supposed to be an MMO at the same time we did. As in, they were making the game, working with the brothers on a daily basis toward that goal. Then the trailer released saying the game was an MMO, and the developers looked at each other like, wait, it's supposed to be an MMO?
This probably lasted
Which
so
does
long.
answer the
No,
question,
don't die.
is it any wonder the game couldn't deliver on its promises when those promises weren't even discussed with the people making it? Next, the report moves on to another area the Russian article discussed prior to the game's release, and that is the treatment of employees. The details here.
I died. Oh, there was another one. How many mobs was that? 35 or something? Get on top of it, you fucking asshole developer. Get on top of that. It was like 35 mobs. It was totally excessive.
But hold that thought.
Your skill has increased.
Work these people to the bone, forced crunch, unpaid, calling it voluntary work, which, as we know, they like to use the term volunteer repeatedly, and this is potentially why. They were working people 16 hours a day, working weekends, no time off, no holidays, no free time. Then, at the drop of a hat, immediate and spontaneous terminations of employees for any reason, and maybe worst of all, they also had, allegedly, a policy of fining employees for their mistakes, meaning not only were they gobbling up young people at the start of their professional career, hooked in by their dream of a job in the industry, getting their foot in the door with what looked like a great opportunity, but they were exploiting these people in every possible way, most of which are illegal almost everywhere on the planet. So they knew they had the only carrot in town, that these young and aspiring employees had nowhere else to turn if they wanted to make their way into the industry, and so they had an infinite source of employees to exploit, and exploit they allegedly did. The example given in the investigation from Game 2 was employees forcibly fined $1,930 for poor quality voice recordings.
Wow.
So these people were inexperienced, underpaid, overworked, and fined by bosses who sabotaged their own product with their delusions and flights of fancy, with the employees being the ones to pay the price. Literally. Not only this, but Game 2 in their interviews with dozens of former employees discuss what other publications have alleged during their own investigations. The brothers are not finished. Just before the game went live, they vanished, likely because they knew what was going to happen to the game. They only actually resurfaced on Microsoft Teams to close the studio and of course write nonsense on social media weeks or months after. The closure of the studio was so abrupt, and of course them appearing out of nowhere after being missing for days, led many former employees to believe that the closure was probably planned. And of course many rumours that Game 2 have also heard that behind the scenes these brothers are allegedly working at a new studio on new games. They are going to return, most likely pulling the same tricks and stunts as documented in this video. Which brings us to, hopefully, the end. But here's the conclusion. What did we learn? Was the day before a scam? That's going to depend on who you ask and what definition you use. Was it a financial fraud from the beginning designed to make money from nothing? No. Clearly the intent at the beginning was to develop a game and make millions of dollars. After all, the brothers had been making games now for close to a decade, trying to scale up from each project into something bigger and bigger and better each time. From day one to the final day, the intent was clearly to distribute a product that would make money. The more, the better. So this wasn't a malicious or malevolent way to try and steal money for something that was never going to exist. And if that was the only factor that mattered, it would be clear-cut to say the day before was just a failed product with no allegations of impropriety or malevolence having any merit. But that isn't the only factor, is it? The decisions made and the steps taken from the minute the public learned of the day before until the closure of the studio and now beyond indicate that there is a much more complex answer to the question of if it was a scam or not. So, facts on the table, the brothers made the decision to show footage of things that didn't exist, that may never exist. They made the decision to bait the press with media releases, to scale up the game while being unable to likely deliver, to lie about the beta testing, to never mention early access, to launch the game with years of deceptive marketing as a totally different and grander project, to launch the completely broken game, and to say they were going to keep the money after merely 5 days of launch for an unfinished product, as well as many other decisions along the way. Whether they knew at every step of the way that they were contributing to a massive train wreck isn't something I can answer, but it's one that I don't need to. We only have to look at the major decisions at the very end. The game releasing in that state, the closure of the studio, the blaming of content creators to shift the blame, lies about what the game state was really like. This type of stuff turns a failed project from a developer that had good intentions to a developer that was deceptive for profit, which many people colloquially will refer to as a scam. And the question of whether or not it's actually legally actionable fraud is irrelevant to that public definition and consensus. For me, the reality here is you had two guys who, according to all reports, have exploited and abused young professionals who are likely to have missed opportunities as a result, and soured their experience in an industry they likely wanted to work in for much of their life. They ruined their own opportunity with delusional management, and they expected the public to pay for this. They fought against reality every single day and allegedly are happy to start it all over again, standing on the shoulders of others, adding weight as they go, but deflecting all blame to those whose backs they break when they fall. Whether this was a scam or they scammers is irrelevant to me, because the end result is worse. No money was lost by the public, but there are still victims of the day before, the employees. The employees are fantastic and not responsible, and almost certainly were just people trying to make the best product they could. Unfortunately, with the brothers at the head of the ship, it was always going to sink, taking everyone down with it.
Oh, bad
so
principles.
That's the day before, the game that everyone is calling the biggest scam in Steam's history due to how popular and far it reached, but with a much more complicated story than that simple title. Unfortunately, this does not appear to be the end of the brothers' career in the games industry, so perhaps this is not the only time I'll be talking about them. Finally, I would like to end on a good note, which is usually rare in these videos. One thing that the day before did was prove that there is an appetite in the industry for a game of this nature, that despite games like DayZ existing and being better than ever, people want more zombie survival games. They would even trust the shadiest developer ever to give one a chance to exist. So perhaps the industry is listening. Maybe the fans of the day before will be playing together in another world one day in the coming years, enjoying a game that actually exists. Hopefully we don't hear from the brothers again, and hopefully people don't join their company and continue to be exploited. But with that, this puts the final bullet in the head of the day before. Thanks for watching.
It was good. Thank you, Kira TV. Oh, this looks bad. Never mind. I don't want to watch that. Ring, a mind melting. Story analysis. Tamriel is interesting. Oh yeah, I want to hear his review of Arcanum again.
Arcanum is an RPG that I like to play in the fall if I can. It is a fantasy game, but made by Troika, whose founders were instrumental in making the original Fallout games. So as you'd expect, this setting already has some bite to it. But if you really take the time to explore the game, there are some dark dealings underneath it all. This all comes packaged inside of an incredibly unique game. It has lots of other merits it can stand on, and plenty of flaws. Like the game engine being an absolute nightmare. Playing it is one thing, and recording it nicely is another. Luckily, there's a good one-stop solution. This is the unofficial Arcanum patch by Drog Blacktooth. He's a Ukrainian modder who's one of the few people on the planet who can actually wrangle the engine. It has tons of fixes, enhancements, and a few options. I'll be playing without those, but keep in mind you can completely change the XP system or even play some races that you couldn't previously, so there's a lot to dig through. For the vanilla player, some assets have been made high quality, including the music, and you could play the game in proper widescreen, so no more of the awkward stretching. That said, you can set the resolution high, like absurdly high. That won't scale well and can lead to weirdness, so stick with the holy 1366 by 768. This will give you more screen space without making the UI the size of bacteria. It also keeps your range of view in line with what the developers intended. It does fix a ton of different bugs, but there are still plenty that remain. This was one of the buggiest CRPGs on release, and even with the big fan patch, it's still a contender. And this could be as good as it gets. Even before the Russian shit show had gone into full swing, Drog Blacktooth had been offline for about a year. At the time of recording, he's still missing, and I hope he's okay. So that's where we're at as far as stability goes. With that out of the way, let's talk about the setting of Arcanum. It's a fascinating world, and the fact that only the single game explores it really is a crime. So the simplest way to put it is that this is D&D during an industrial revolution. You have orcs, you have steam engine trains, you have magic, you have factories, you have orcs forming unions at the steam engine factories. Science is moving at a pace far faster than ethics can catch up. You see the effects of it all over the game and can dig deep into the implications of it and how it affects everyone. Of course, you might be wondering, if technology is that far ahead, how the hell do you mix that with magic? You know, if you can snap your fingers and make fire, then who invents a Zippo? Well, for one, technology is far more accessible. You could spend years training some Wedgiemancer to master throwing a lightning bolt, assuming they're even magically inclined. Or you could spend a week or two training a bunch of farmhands how to use a gun. In Universe, this idea was put to the test in a war between two kingdoms with disastrous results. Though there is another layer in how technology and magic interact. It's explained in-game at a few points, but the manual has some of the best examples, and it's just an awesome manual in general. See, technology works within the confines of physical natural law. A steam engine works within rules that don't change, like energy and gravity. Better technology accounts for more rules and more variations, but the law itself doesn't change. An object's weight may change at a higher elevation, but the concept of weight doesn't break. Magic is nonsense that does whatever it wants. For magic to even exist, it must break and warp every physical law you know of. Casting a reading light might change how friction works in a small radius around you. Now, this doesn't matter a lot if you're in some medieval village or a field, but say you're near objects or devices that highly rely on these laws. So what if friction changes for a moment when you're in some room? However, this becomes less fun and whimsical when you're, say, riding on a train. You just want to magic away little problems, so what if things change? Oh right, trains like rules like that working. That's why you get to go through the enchanted TSA before being allowed to board, where carrying a wand and an owl might as well brand you as a member of ISIS. More magic can mean needing to ride in the back of the train where there's no chance of messing up the steam engine. Too much magic means you're not allowed to ride and no fast travel for you. Though you might be able to teleport around, so who cares. Still, in a world where common people can enjoy more benefits, this means magic users are more innately disruptive. Magic adds randomization to how an inclined plane works. Let's try electricity now. You're powerful if you can use magic, but also becoming a kind of social outcast in a changing world. It's interesting because it explores magic as being real as, what if magic was real? It's not something like a shoved-in racism allegory since they just talk about racism. I mean, there's a series of books called The Orcish Question, they're just fucking going for it. Well, come to think of it, some races are more innately magical, so what happens to them when the world changes too far? There's a different book that explores that. It's just neat to explore these ideas as these ideas. If there's a social issue they want to explore, they just explore it. So it gives you unique, memorable situations instead of an allegorical nightmare castle.
Well, I lived
you know,
just
like
barely.
whatever the fuck is going on in Dragon Age.
I believe that I am fortunate to have been spared a lot of the problems others have been experiencing with their workers. I do believe it is because I treat my workers better than most. Why, their working conditions are almost human.
There's also no dark magic or, ooh, evil forbidden magic. It's all context sensitive. How you use magic will affect how people respond to you. It's just another tool. Though if something like raising the dead is something that would take a mage years to learn and figure out all the dangers of, what happens when any Joe Schmo can raise the dead? Should they be able to? Should anyone do this? I feel like I'm already getting ahead of myself, but Arcanum just does that. I'll get into where the plot kicks off before I go too far. You're taking a ride aboard the first blimp in Arcanum's maiden voyage, the IFS Zephyr. Things take a turn for the worst when it's attacked by ogre raiders and airplanes. If you've read the manual, or a fairy tale, you'll know that ogres aren't too bright and definitely didn't build these. The very first blimp is being attacked by the first planes. The blimp eventually does go down, and one bandit is scratched for the trouble. The only two survivors are you, and an elderly gnome. He says he's come to warn about a great evil, giving you a ring and telling you to find the boy, and he'll know what to do from there. Then he dies. The second you crawl out of the wreckage, you're ambushed by Virgil. He's a new acolyte of something called the Panari religion and believes you to be extremely important. You surviving the blimp crash aligns with the Panari prophecy in a Book of Revelations kind of way. Virgil believes you are the living one, the reincarnation of some kind of elf Jesus who will strike down the evil one who will soon rise. Christ was also called Jesus of Nazareth, and in our setting, our elf savior is called Nazredin. That could make it easier to remember. Not only have you crashed in the mountains directly next to an altar for this prophecy, but there are a group of assassins out to kill any survivor of the wreck. So you can go with Virgil's plan as you try to find where the ring goes, or just ditch him from the get-go. You don't have to be Dante just because he showed up. And that's about all you need for now. Let's look at the visuals.
What is this?
For a 90s CRPG, it looks okay, except that it came out in 2001. All the movement and animation has this kind of clunky jerkiness to it. It's to a point where I genuinely can't tell if the original Fallout did it better or not, and Fallout came out 4 years before this. Speaking of which, the world itself usually has a very similar color palette to Fallout. No, it's not as brown because a nuke didn't go off in most of the map, but even when it's more green, it's generally a washed out and muddy place unless you're in the most enchanted of forests. There are still some striking buildings and places to see in the game, but it's overall washed out and muted. Now this does fit the tone way better than having it be a Skittles fantasy wonderland, but there were points where I think it could have broken from the mold a bit more without hurting it. It's frequently dark and gloomy even when the game says you should be in the height of comfort. It makes it even harder for my brain to escape Fallout when I play it. Even when areas are really prettied up, the ghost of it is always there. This is one of the main reasons I like to play it more in the fall if I can. The dark griminess is perfect for what you're uncovering, even if the game can just look downright ugly at points. Also the gore. Getting punched by an elemental and your head flying off is very Fallout. The kills can be damn brutal, and it's something nice to say about Arcanum's combat. There won't be a whole lot of that, so it's not a great looking game, but there are some neat flashes here and there. As for audio, it's a mix of higher highs and lower lows. A lot of the interface sounds are good, but the game's soundscape when it comes to the environment and combat is pretty generic. At worst, there can be a lot of annoyances, like looping sound effects from spell buffs. Drog's patch actually has an option to straight up remove annoying sound effects because there are so many to find. Oh, that's why I never summon the familiar. See, that's pretty funny until you have an army of them. Let me switch to real time. These moments aren't too often, but it does help combat feel like more of a mess. There are two audio standouts, and the first is the voice acting. There aren't a ton of voiced characters in the game, and those who do speak might only have a few lines. Only Virgil and the most plot-significant characters will have a lot to say.
My crime, it seems, is even more heinous than I thought. I deserve much worse than this mere isolation.
Why do you ask? You're not a labor sympathizer, are you? A unionizer, perhaps? I can assure you, my workers are happy to have the jobs I give them.
There's something like 24 followers you can recruit in the game, but only a handful of those have a voice. Those that do usually have precious few lines, too. There are plenty I wish I could have heard more input from, but they were stretched thin already. Like Gar, the world's smartest orc.
Yes, Gar like tea. Gar civilized. Gar say Earl Grey best. Made from blend of black teas and oil from the bergamot plant. Excellent, Gar say. Oh, come now, that is rubbish. Green tea is for the foreign constitution, not for consumption by those with discerning... Gar no like green tea.
This is reflective of the whole game, really. Arcanum spends a lot more time fleshing out the setting than it does going too deep into any of the characters. It gives you a few to kind of unpack, but focuses more on giving you more options for replay. That brings us to our second standout, which is the music. game is set in an otherworldly 1800s, and the music reflects it. Instead of big, epic Baldur's Gate orchestra, it's string quartet. Not to say a big symphony is bad for an RPG, but there was a different idea behind Arcanum. You're not necessarily playing a heroic character, so you don't have a heroic theme. This is why the main theme is a whole mix of different emotions and tone. They're all possibilities. I feel like shit having to interrupt the Arcanum theme, but if I don't, I'll get stuck here. The combat music is more percussion heavy and still very fitting and welcome. The combat tracks in particular do have that age-old RPG problem where there just isn't enough variety for the amount of time you're playing it. The game could have gotten a ton more mileage out of a few more combat tracks, especially when the one you hear the most is reused for the dwarven areas. It's nice clanking, but it keeps coming back. Anyway, properly getting started, your first step is character creation. There are some presets too, and the ones you don't pick can be found dead around the Zephyr crash site. It's still well worth the time going custom, especially with how many rich backgrounds there are. You can be raised by snake handlers, be an escaped lunatic with combat bonuses, or be a special person who has intelligence lost from brain damage. But this makes people like you more if you're good because they're just so charmed by that. Backgrounds are never brought up directly in conversation, but they add a lot of fun variation. On the other hand, your gender, and especially your race, will be incredibly significant. People who were nice to you when you played as a human or an elf can completely become different people if you play as a half-orc or an ogre. You might lose some quests while new ones open up, and you might pay more for a worse room at an inn. You might have to overcome so much more just to reach a simple interaction that another character might not even think about, though people looking down on you is something you can use to your advantage too. Because they underestimate your capabilities, you can get the drop on them in many situations. So this is one of your biggest decisions. It's not a throwaway, a half-orc line, it's get the fuck out of my bar, or cops eyeing you up, and you'll never be invited to the phrenology department party. Race can be a complicated thing, and Arcanum is no different. Actually, it might be way more complicated here. After this is where you choose your initial stats, skills, spells, and schematics. Your stats have all kinds of effects, and they also determine how many points you could put into a skill, and each skill has 5 levels. There are 16 skills across 4 categories: combat, stealth, social, and technology. Though separate from tech skills, there are 8 different technology disciplines. These can range from mechanical engineering, electrical, chemistry, gunsmithing. Knowledge in a field grants you schematics and lets you understand more advanced schematics. You can find or buy these in the world, and once you do, you can craft all kinds of useful objects. If you're playing something like a gunslinger, being able to craft your own bullets can be essential. Or maybe you want to be a smart boy who doesn't do the fighting, and that's what the robots are for. Though a lot of this depends on you actually being able to hunt down the parts. And even then there are ways to get around actually having points in the field, and technology is a bit of a mess in Arcanum. It's still doable, but clunky for a first time build, and there are some other reasons for that too, which I'll get into soon. Then you have 16 schools of magic with 5 spells each. Everything you've seen so far, whether it's a stat or a spell or a skill or a technology field, it all costs the same point. You've got a huge amount of options, and yes, if it seems too complicated, you can pick an auto level up scheme based on some classes. What's important is that Arcanum isn't very good as a jack-of-all-trades game. There are some things restricted to good and evil alignments, and how you actually get up to the ending of the game can vastly change based on that. But remember our laws of magic? Well, that carries on into the gameplay. Your aptitude towards tech or magic is also measured. You can play the entire game with this at 0, but when you start putting points in technology disciplines or magic schools, then it'll start to skew over. This gives boons to what you're leaning towards and disadvantages for the other side. If you're too magic, tech shops don't even want you close to their inventory, but your spells scale better. As a necromancer, the exact same summon undead spell will give you tougher monsters. At the same time, tech becomes much more unstable to use. You might just miss attacks more, or atomize yourself with your own rifle. These principles work in reverse too, like tech characters can't use magic scrolls. Also, technology reinforces the laws of natural law around it, or some shit like that, so more advanced technology acts as a magic dampening field. This means a follower like Virgil, who's an incredibly effective magic healer, becomes more and more useless to a tech character, so they'll need to seek out more potions or healing skills or other more pain-in-the-ass methods. Unless you build the mechanical healing spider. Skills themselves can be trained more outside of points, which gives all kinds of bonus effects, and then master levels can have special missions attached to them, so every replay is even more different, and man, there are so many ways to play. I should go over some. My first character is Windsor McScammington, the protege of a charlatan. He's all about persuasion and making deals and has high charisma. Having high charisma in Arcanum lets you recruit more followers, which starts easy enough in the first town by convincing a drunk half-ogre to tag along, but as he grows in power, he assembles a certified hit squad. Training up persuasion lets him recruit followers he might not be able to otherwise based on alignment. They're also more forgiving of who he murders, which is good because Scammington is also a necromancer. You can kill everyone in the game and still beat it, but conjuring spirits still means I could pull information from dead key characters. Several whodunit quests can be made way easier by just raising the victim's spirit and asking what happened. If a follower dies, they can be made undead until receiving proper resurrection treatment. You can summon the undead out of thin air, resurrect the dead, resurrect the undead. It's one of the best RPGs you can play a necromancer in. There are just so many options. Not many games have ice gorillas you can fight and then turn into your thralls. Most spirits appear to be in horrible pain and not happy to be back in the material world, but the game accounts for them. You can just say, I'm a necromancer and I talk to them. Not interested in doing some shitty quest for information? Well, dead men do tell tales when they really want to go back to the afterlife. My other character is an ogre named Clug Slabbrain. He has borderline starfish IQ, but he's strong and wants to do the right thing. Where Virgil had to make an appeal to a smarter character like Scammington, the dynamic is completely different here. Now he's in caretaker mode, constantly on the verge of a mental breakdown, finding out that Elf Jesus is back in the body of an idiot.
Why did the gods return your spirit in this defective shell?
Clug is fast too, and even in the first area, Virgil can barely keep up. To make matters worse, Dr. Steve Brule can't mangle a name like Clug can. What do we do now, Horatio?
Virgil. My name is Virgil!
What do we do now, Valklava?
I don't even know what you just called me.
He's too dumb to know spells, too dumb to spell words. Even some racist characters are more offended by how stupid he is over anything else. And I'm honestly angry he's able to read newspapers. But he's still a good boy, and some people find it endearing when he introduces himself as dumb. Sure, he might lose out on followers and understanding most of the plot, but boy can he go through those dungeons fast. This is the most entertaining game to play a dumbass in, more so than any of the Fallouts. Sometimes you are too dumb for quests, but if you really don't want to miss out, there are some temporary intellect potions around. So Clug can just snort up some flowers for Algernon before the big test. This sudden shift can make people uncomfortable, but they'll deal with him then. Afterwards, he could get back to calling the wizard Jungle Dune Jingle, or Jungle Jin, and just get back to doing regular Clugisms. It's a simple example, but shows just how different two playthroughs can be. All these dignified, self-important 19th century characters, and they have to deal with a living rock.
You go to island where bad people are.
There's a lot that's cool about Arcanum's thought-out systems. There are also plenty of skills and aspects that could be easily replaced. Scammington is a persuasive character, and how persuasion works in this game is great. He can come up with better arguments or better lies, but only based on things he knows. For example, the first small town you get to has a gang of bandits guarding the bridge. They want a protection fee to pass, and their leader thinks he's an educated genius. Except he doesn't know what any words actually mean and calls himself Lucan the Witless. He calls himself a thief extraordinary, and if you're too wordy with him, he calls your words flatulent. The dude just flat out doesn't know what the fuck he's saying. If you get on his case about it, it'll lead to a fight. But naturally, you can convince him to let you pass. He's a moron, but he's not Clug. You can pretend you're from a guild of thieves and that he's muscled in on your territory. The thing is, if you try to lie with something he knows beyond doubt is a lie, the jig is up. He knows you're trying to fleece him, and any further persuasion attempts aren't going to work. It's like this with every character when you're attempting persuasion. No matter how good and tear-jerking your story is about how good friends you are with the guy you're trying to get to, and his mom, the story isn't going to work if the guard knows he's an orphan. Persuasion is still incredibly powerful, but it's not a magic spell, and you benefit more from it the more you actually know about the world and the setting. On top of just having the skill, you still have to carefully think and choose your options. Now you could put a point in persuasion or a different skill like gambling. You can win money playing dice with dock workers, and if you do train it up, you can win some pretty powerful items with it. It's not nearly as overpowered as Fallout 1's gambling, but it's okay, I guess. Okay, how about the beauty stat? This will affect people's initial perceptions towards you, but that'll change rapidly once you two get talking. Something like lockpicking and pickpocketing could also be useful skills, but there's ways around that too. For one, Arcanum has something called fate points, which you get by achieving things in the story. You can spend one for a critical success at all kinds of skills. So an item that maybe only a master thief should be able to get, you can just fate point away. Something like lockpicking doesn't matter much either when you can break open most doors and chests. If you save and recruit Dogmeat, aka the Destroyer of Worlds, not only do you get a powerful melee companion, but he doesn't have weapons to lose durability with. He's great at killing golems, and he's a universal guest key. No barrier or lock, no matter how ancient or arcane, can stop the power of the dog. Honestly, your party can still do this too, you don't lose a whole ton of durability by bashing. There are trap disarming skills, but not a whole lot of traps in the game after the Hell Gauntlet. It's fun there are so many options, it's more that this game is extremely easy to break on every level. At the same time, they did have interesting, clever ideas on how they could balance it. Going back to the bridge bandits, Klug walks up and gurgles at them. Lucan takes pity on him, noticing that he is clearly mentally retarded. Oh, the tributaries that this man... Klug massacres the entire gang. He gets XP for doing this, not distributed on kills, but on hits. Here's the idea with that. Scamington's persuasive ways means he'll be offered all kinds of quests and can even skip out entire dungeons through dialogue. He has a squad of followers too, so if they were all leveling up together, he would be absurd. So at the big party, they handle the combat that the necromancer spells and the zombies can't get. The gang as a whole is a lower level than average, but they're an effective fighting force. Klug is getting some quests and murdering most things nearly single-handedly. Him being better at combat and getting more hits in should make up for the loss of XP from getting less quests, right? Well, it does at first. For a while. You don't need to be max level to beat the game, but the balancing feels weird throughout all of it. There can be weird difficulty spikes inside the same dungeon. I've thought for a while about how to put into words what's wrong with the combat. You can switch between real-time and pause by pressing spacebar, but it's going to be the same level of pain. Do you want vibrating out of the material plane fast, or a DMV on a holiday slow? Combat is either laughably trivial, or a molasses wave of frustration. I don't think I've ever thought, that was a neat fight, while playing this game. Sure, it's funny when Klug wipes out the 3 bears in 3 seconds, but that's it. At its best, Arcanum's combat is extremely funny. Another reason I don't often use firearms is because bows exist. You can cast spells or shoot as fast as you can click. The NPCs click fast, and this also goes for your enemies. It seems like the general rule is, if you're just playing the game, leave it on real time. If you start to melt in 5 seconds, then switch on turn-based. I don't mind when an RPG has a harder encounter that you're supposed to come back to later, but Arcanum can switch things up in 10 meters. Even with a Klug build, it moves so fast that it's disorienting. Otherwise, it will go extremely slow even with the fast turn-based option. There's no sense of what the normal combat speed should be. None of this is normal, so pick your poison. I mean, you do have a crazy amount of options for what you can do in combat. There is merit in all those options, but even the encounters themselves aren't great either. Most of the combat dungeons you go through are so tedious and dull. Like, some of the largest ones are different sewers. The maps have such convoluted flow to them too, and there's rarely anything interesting to find. There can be exceptions to the rule, like finding a potential follower inside an ancient temple, or looking for dwarves when you stumble upon the lair of Kurgan, the first necromancer. He was a bad enough dude that Nazardin and the Ancient Council banished him into the void. These are neat additions, but again, they're neat additions for the story and the intrigue, not the combat. Now luckily, after the first third or so of the game, there aren't any more required big dungeons. In fact, the gauntlet leading up to the end is mercifully small and straightforward. If the combat was better, this would feel like a letdown, but instead, it's a feature. A lot of these are tied to optional stuff around the map, and there is a ton of this. You can travel around the map at a faster speed, only being stopped for a random encounter, but you can travel the map completely manually if you want. It'll just take something like 30 hours to cross it. That means if you find a dungeon, you can just leave. I think that alone seals it, but what about Klug? Combat meatheads like him are going to need more fights to keep up. Sure, he's slow, but deserves an arc too. You might have to do more dungeon diving to see it, but that's what you signed up for.
We need to... Hey, you called me Virgil. Good show! Perhaps you're wising up a bit after all.
So combat is bizarre. All kinds of systems are a mess, like alignment, for example. If you want to cheese it, you could just shower a beggar with money until you ascend to heaven, or yell at them to get a job until you become Satan. If it's that rough, why would anyone play this beyond it being fun to break? Are the world and interactions really that good? Yes, it is that good. Beyond the main quest, there's tons of stuff to do and so many ways to resolve many of the situations. The unified kingdom capital of Tarant is one of the most content-dense cities I've played in an RPG. There are obvious places to pick up missions, sure, but even random NPCs might have something to offer. There are mysteries to solve, dark, grand conspiracies, and just weird, fun little side stories. That Thieves Guild I mentioned before has over a dozen break-in and heist quests to pick up. There are exorcisms to perform and all kinds of missions that cross cities and kingdoms. That war I mentioned before between gunpowder users and sword conservatives is something you can really delve into. The Kingdom of Cumbria lost the war with Tarant and the rest of the Unified Kingdom. Their land is run down and rotting both physically and politically. The current king's right to rule is dubious at best, and the trauma from the war has caused them to outlaw virtually all technology. Which isn't practical in this changing world, but it's not all black and white either. Cumbria had honorable virtues before, it's just the current system is the worst, most destructive parts of staying traditional at all costs. You can contribute to restoring this kingdom and finding its place in a new world without destroying its identity. The Unified Kingdom has issues too. Tarant used to be a monarchy, but technology destabilized power there too. When the royal family was all found dead or missing, the Gnomish Merchants Guild took control. Profits and technological progress now eclipse all else, even as a ton of people suffer. The fate of the country can be decided by how you handle a side quest about an orc worker strike. This is all some side shit you can do. There are 36 ending slides. A lot of what you do is taken into account. Though yeah, when the main quest takes you to new areas, the amount of quests you get do taper off, but it's still a hell of a lot more than most, and plenty of random locations and things to discover all the way up until the end. Speaking of, from here I'm going to talk about the main quest and that quest in more detail. So if you don't want spoilers, go to here. Right, find the boy and deliver the ring. Assassins are desperately searching for you and the ring. The only clue it offers are the initials GB. However, a local shopkeeper recognizes it as being from a store in Tarant. There's a dwarf outside the store named Magnus who's also irritated he can't get answers from the store owners. Apparently they're reclusive, and even the doorman doesn't want to talk about what goes on downstairs. Magnus thinks they don't have answers into what dwarven clan he hails from and tags along for the ride. Maybe. This turns out to be like finding a Diablo level beneath a JC Penney, and it becomes worse when you find that the lowest level is full of undead dwarves. The owners are a family of necromancers who found the dwarf tomb long ago and built a shop over it. Magnus is horrified because he thinks this might be his lost clan, but there's something strange about these dwarves. If you don't immediately murder the owners, they'll explain the situation. What they're doing is perfectly legal, but they're keeping it secret because it is unsavory. It becomes obvious that these aren't Magnus's ancestors, but they go farther to say that he shouldn't be offended. Noble dwarf clans always reside in the mountains, and this is out in the flatlands. They have sloped foreheads and extra fingers and toes. The necromancers doubt they were even literate, so they're already dead and even in life were likely freaks and outcasts, which makes what they're doing perfectly okay. This can end in violence, or nice and politely. This is a minor event in the grand scheme of things, but it does establish how far things can go in the setting for those deemed lesser. One way or another, you find out the ring belongs to Gilbert Bates. He's the inventor of the steam engine, and the rival to Cedric Appleby. Anyways, Bates is very interested in this ring. He's baffled to learn a gnome gave it to you, and when you describe him, it turns out it wasn't a gnome at all, but a dwarf named Stenar Rockcutter. This is near unthinkable, as dwarves have a saying that they'd rather cut their own throat than their beard. So Stenar had done that, and starved himself and withered away to disguise himself as a gnome. Bates is getting a sinking feeling about this. When Bates was a teenager, he was a bit of a dwarf weeb, and still is really, but he hoped to be welcomed into the Black Mountain clan by showing how well he understood their technology. They laughed at him and humored him, and Stenar was his only real friend. It's revealed that Bates saw a steam engine in the corner of the Black Mountain Hold. He saw the potential in it and tried to tell them, but they all just laughed him off again. So he sold an application of it to a human company, and it took off around the world. When Bates returned to the clan to show proof of his success, they were all gone. He was then threatened by hooded figures who said he could never reveal the origins of the steam engine, and so became known as its inventor. Stenar still called him the boy because dwarves live a lot longer than humans and probably got mixed up. It's possible there are still some clues in their old home, and you find plenty of monsters and plenty of dead assassins who also picked up on this trail. This is the Golem Cave dedicated to breaking your weapons, and it sucks. After crossing a Korean DMZ level of landmines, you do find a single Black Mountain clan survivor. He's gone crazy from being alone for decades, but says another dwarf clan, the Wheel clan, banished them. He carved the full story out in a rock behind him when he was less crazy. The crime was sharing technology with humans. And to make it even stranger, elves carried out the actual banishment. They sent the Black Mountain clan to a lovely retreat called the Isle of Despair. Their disappearance appears to be entirely Bates's fault. He takes it well, all things considered, and arranges your passage to the Isle of Despair, which is a prison island. And guess what? There's no Black Mountain clan here either. Every time you think you have a lead, it just opens up a new mystery. All of Virgil's Panari spiel, saying you're the living one and Nazarden reincarnated, it seems completely unrelated. You do learn that the evil one is Aranax, who's just an ancient elf supremacist. It would be like saying Christ will soon return to destroy the founder of the KKK, like Panari is a strange religion. There's some interesting stuff on the Isle of Despair. You can find an ancient crashed submarine which likely belonged to the Vendigroth civilization. They were very technologically advanced, but disappeared about 2,000 years ago. There's also a well-educated half-ogre prisoner who is a pretty rare find. He talks about books and his childhood memories of living in an orphanage. An all-half-ogre orphanage, which even he thinks is strange. Humans and ogres hooking up willingly is pretty rare, but that must have been the fad at the time. Otherwise, the crime would be so widespread and often that ogres would be hunted down and killed by now. So he's an interesting dude. There's also a prisoner who has a part for an ancient Vendigroth gun. Back on track, the prison's leader is a dwarf, but he's a Wheel Clan dwarf. He tells you the Black Mountain clan never showed up there, so you should go check in with the Wheel Clan. This is really emphasizing the setting over character aspect I mentioned earlier. Bates is probably the most developed so far, but it's not a whole ton. There is some irony in that as much as he loves the dwarves, he has a lot of underlying anger for them not accepting him. As a short-lived human, he didn't have their aged wisdom, and they thought he had nothing to contribute. He felt so strongly against this that it significantly shaped his life, and then he'll turn around and do the same thing to the races working in his factories. So it's something. If Magnus is still around, you'll learn he's a city dwarf trying to figure out what being a dwarf actually means. And his How to Be a Dwarf culture manual was written by a human. Virgil has an uncanny amount of street knowledge and implies things were very different before joining the Panari, but he's still not opening up a lot. So it's all about the mystery. When you get to the Wheel Clan, they're still kicking along, but have seen better days. Their leader is the Prince, currently ruling over with the title of King in Waiting. The real king, Loghaire Thunderstone, has been gone for decades. After overseeing the Black Mountain clan being hauled off by the elves, he was so overcome with grief that he banished himself to the Dredge. It's a terrible mud labyrinth inside the mountain, and we can skip over that with persuasion. The prince talks to Dad just about daily. In fact, he's right behind the store.
Quiet. This insolence is unforgivable. The violation of my ancient right for solitude and exile is not broken so easily.
I could listen to Loghaire talk for hours, and while he doesn't go on that long, he is enlightening. The other races consider technology in the hands of humans dangerous because of their short lives. In his view, everything humans do is fueled by the fear of death and their relative instant gratification. Humans are fascinated by the effects a new thing can bring now, and not thinking about the long-term consequences, which you have been seeing throughout the entire game. Bates did screw up, but his line of thinking wasn't special.
His first thought was, what can I use this for? When it should have been, what is the cost of its use? Technology exploded in their hands because they are not burdened with our longevity. Humans rarely live long enough to see the consequences of their mistakes.
As for what specifically happened, humans began cutting down trees. Their logging was so efficient that they were wiping out huge areas of elven forests, and we know how elves always feel about trees. They were so angry that they personally wanted to carry out the punishment, and if the Wheel Clan wouldn't let them, they would declare war on all dwarves. Loghaire let them, felt ashamed for letting them, and exiled himself. If you know dwarven philosophy, you can convince him to return to the throne. The Wheel Clan will be ecstatic about this if you do, but now regardless, you have to find the elves. Finding them can involve hunting down Arcanum's Bigfoot, but I don't want to get into that.
Gonna get some of the
The
drink.
elves
I'll
in
be
the
right
glimmering
back.
forest, but where in the forest? In the trees. In what trees? In the glimmering forest. Okay then.
Please, we must cease our attack upon such a good soul.
He's not good, Gar. He's an elf. Sorry, sir, you're dead. Where are the elves? Where's Kentara? In the forest. Trees. Oh, goddamn. Look at that. It's the elves. And get this. They've never heard of any of this happening. When you speak to their ruler, she only speaks in riddles. They've been living in their collection of fancy trees and have nothing to do with the dwarves. Instead, it may have been dark elves.
Well, I believe that may have been so because many...
There, I'm gonna pause it for just a second. I apologize. So... full. I take a look at my phone and see if there's a deal. Okay. 50 million.
Garad is a dark name.
Of course they did, so now you've got to find out where the...
Greetings, traveler. It seems to me that you're looking for answers, don't you know?
And you then get a random encounter with Aranax. He confirms that whether or not you're the living one, the reincarnation of Nazardin, he will be coming back soon and he will face you down. And so far, this still seems like it has nothing to do with the main quest. Finding the Dark Elves will mean locating a book with their location. Back in the capital, you stumble across a guy looking for another guy, and this leads to a lot of intrigue around a set of skulls. They're from a set of conjoined Siamese twins, and the man who sent you to find them says they're proof of a massive breeding experiment. He wants you to find his partner, who is missing where he tells you to look, but you happen to find him again in the same town where you're seeking out the Dark Elf book. The strange amount of half-ogres in the kingdom can be explained by visiting an island offshore. This is where things take a turn for the fucking gruesome. It's not a breeding experiment, it's a breeding factory. Powerful members of the Gnome Council have been kidnapping women and forcing them to birth half-ogres. At first, this would always kill the host, but after developing some new surgical techniques, they could get a few more out of them. The only items you can find on Half-Ogre Island are pretty grim. This is when you realize whenever you see powerful gnomes, they're always flanked by a half-ogre bodyguard. They're generally dumb, but loyal and controllable. The dissolving of the royal family makes more
Okay, sorry guys, I gotta pause the video here for just a minute. Gotta run upstairs, and terribly sorry, but I will not be long, like 5 minutes. I'm gonna pause the video.
bodyguards.
Okay,
And he
sorry
goes,
about that.
Maybe it's real, who knows. If you
Gonna
kill
pause
this
to eat
creep,
a
it says
sandwich
his
here.
alignment is good, so maybe he didn't participate in it directly. Or something, I don't know. If you take evidence to the press, the journalist is horrified, promising to write a story, and when you come back he's gone. Replaced with someone who doesn't know what you're talking about. If you return to the island, all the evidence is gone. And that is the end of the quest. It was a side quest. It's a sickening thing to stumble onto the first time you play the game and completely changes how you see the world now. It also makes Klug more tragic, though thankfully he's too stupid to even start the quest line. It's a bizarre, dark inclusion with no direct way to resolve it. You can't really undo it either, only expose it. You could obliterate every gnome on site, but you'll never get the text prompt saying the situation is fixed. You can resolve it indirectly by completely destabilizing the country in the ending slides. That would mean the council would lose its power, and maybe the fantasy eugenics program would end, but I guess a whole nation of people would suffer for the crimes of their creepy elite, but nothing is new there. What was happening in the main quest again? Something about dark elves and a prophecy? The big issue with this is that it's a side quest with very direct consequences. You immediately know how it's a problem and how huge it is, and you're likely getting it in a period of having no idea where things are going, and it immediately grabs your attention away from it. There are interesting ideas happening in the main story, but this immediately upstages it. It's one of the most mind-melting, horrible reveals in an RPG, and it's just a side thing. It's hard to recover from that one. I'll try to get back to it. You gain an audience with the Dark Elves by claiming to be one of the assassins who did you in. Honestly, they're similar to regular elves, just with a lot more racism.
I'm dead.
Elves think
Aw.
they're the master race even though they won't say it. Dark Elves know they are and scream it. So this trip to the literal Eagle's Nest reveals a lot. The Black Mountain Clan dwarves were banished to the Void. This is where Nazardin and the Council threw the most evil people in back in the day, including Aranax. Arcanum has magical wards that are keeping him trapped in the Void, and the dwarves were supposed to build a machine inside the Void to bust him out. Aranax is extremely magical, so the wards have a heavy effect on him. Stenar is the opposite, so is able to escape from the Void using the machine, even though it's not ready for Aranax yet. The wards don't affect him as strongly, so he got out to warn people. Bates wasn't the cause, he was an excuse. The Dark Elves want Aranax back. If you're evil, you could join with them from here to get to the ending, but you miss out on some reveals, so I'll stick with the path of good for now. If Virgil is still with you, he takes off now. The stakes were high enough that he has something to take care of in case the world ends. Returning to the elves, their leader will cryptically tell you that the answer lies with Nazardin, which if you are him, meaning you are the answer or something like that, but Nazardin does have a physical form. The main Panari temple holds the body of Nazardin beneath it. The story is really starting to come together now. It's all lining up, and maybe as a necromancer I could just bring the dude back and ask him what's going on. Sadly, a bunch of early church records are destroyed, but it is known you're not supposed to mess with Nazardin's body. From here you get into some shenanigans unpacking their religion. Virgil is also in town, murdered by gangsters. With a resurrect scroll, you can bring him back, and he'll explain how he was trying to atone for his past life. He lost someone because of his actions and couldn't live with it anymore. But when Virgil died, he saw him in the afterlife and felt at peace. The afterlife is a quiet, tranquil place in Arcanum, and Virgil carries that with him now. You celebrate his new oneness by breaking into the Panari temple and digging up their Christ figure. It's not Nazardin, it's not even an elf, it's an old Panari saint. This has disturbing implications, and after further research, you find out the Panari faith has been interfered with for hundreds of years. I can't get into why yet, but it's clear Nazardin's real remains are on the island of Thanatos, also known as Evil Tabasco Gorilla Island. After a trek of that monkey madness, you find an old man who might know where to go. After only a bit of talking, it becomes clear that this is Nazardin. He used his powerful abilities to extend his life and not much else, and Aranax is his son. Aranax single-handedly wiped out the ancient Vendigroth civilization out of fear of their technology. His crime was great enough to be boinked with a void sentence, except that he was so magic and it took so much energy, it weakened the barrier between the worlds. So the wards were created to help maintain that barrier. Nazardin exiled himself, and the last council member put a plan in place. Knowledge of how to maintain the wards could be lost over time, so he founded the Panari religion primarily to include rites to maintain the wards. They'll keep doing the rituals even if they don't know why. At a later point, the Dark Elves made sneaky adjustments to the religion. The wards would no longer be maintained well, and Aranax would be hyped up as a mythological Satan figure instead of a very real elf supremacist who wants to break out. That way, the threat of him won't be taken seriously. Having a religion formed and then manipulated over the power struggles of very mortal beings is an insane reveal. You're not the chosen one. It's all bullshit, and Jesus is right there. He's deeply unhappy about being worshipped, but realistically understands he can't do much about it. Fortunately, there is a way to turbo mega kill Aranax. Before Vendigroth got cataclysmically own-zoned, they invented a device that would wipe out even the most powerful mage. If you go get that, Nazardin will banish you into the void, and you can take down Aranax. So you get it. Kiss your mortal coil goodbye, and welcome to the void. The void is strange. In their eternal wisdom, Nazardin and the Council didn't actually know if anything was over here. There are the remains of some kind of civilization. Whether they dwelled here and blew themselves up, or colonized this area, or what, is never explained. There are theories that cycles of tech and magic have gone on forever, and without a doubt, magic used to have 8 spells in a school instead of 5. The Void could be one of those sides taken to an extreme end. There is a lot of combat with Void creatures, and in the first structure, shockingly quickly, there's Aranax.
Many thanks for releasing me from my horribly lengthy incarceration, sir.
No, I'm here to murder you.
Now, why would you want to do that?
Aren't you out to conquer the world and—
I have no such fantasies of revenge. I have been imprisoned here for nearly 2,000 years, which is more than enough time to regret the mistakes of one's youth.
Aranax had nothing to do with any of this. It was all Kurgan. You remember Kurgan, right? The first necromancer who's barely mentioned throughout the entire game? Or maybe his influence has been more noticeable, but you weren't looking for it. This is bold. You only know Aranax on a very surface level, and only because you're paying attention and trying to look out for more information about him. As a villain, he's been kept so vague that he's not very interesting. Now it's revealed the big bad evil guy is a puppet master who we know even less about. Most evil genius puppet master villains will show their hand more for dramatic effect. Only sharply looking for it on replay can you see the tiny hints of Kurgan's manipulation. The Dark Elves thought they had their hand over a major religion and a large part of civilization. In the end, they were being played too. The Aranax they want to come back can never come back. He's had time to reflect and grow past what he was. On the other side, Kurgan has been in the Void longer. He was the only human on the Ancient Council. For all we know, they chucked him into a new civilization and he broke it and twisted it to his will. Whatever he's up to, it clearly wasn't for ego. He's been masquerading as someone else and promising a dark savior who will never show up. Said savior, who was a living holocaust, has been there 2,000 years and still barely knows what Kurgan's up to. This dude is deadly. Aranax can join your party. You can even wander the Void recruiting history's literal greatest monsters to join you in the fight. They've all been banished here too for similar unspeakable crimes. Entering Kurgan's castle, most of the Black Mountain clan is slaughtered, though there are a few survivors. The device is ready, and Kurgan awaits.
Greetings. Long have I waited for your arrival, and finally this moment has come. I am Kurgan, first of the Necromancers, Voyager in the lands of the dead.
His delivery will change a bit based on whether or not Aranax is present. No matter the case, you're still going to have lots of questions, and he's happy to talk. In his mortal life, he was obsessed with necromancy and death, and here in the Void that's only gone farther. He's gained some new insight into the matter after thousands of years.
Yes. Look at me. And what do you see? A monster? An abomination? You've no idea what I've discovered. You see with eyes tainted by life, and all what's that accursed state
This
of
is the end.
bodies.
I want
My
to
vision
get
is
off
clear
it.
because of those magics you hold in disdain. And the Council, it is they I have to thank for it.
You don't age in the Void, and it's hard to measure the passage of time. This explains why Stenar actually called Gates the boy. While Kurgan kept in the shadows until now, it's clear that he actually does have a gigantic ego. The Dark Elves had no clue.
Yes, I know. Ironic, isn't it?
I'm gonna watch something different. Thank you, Mandalore. I'm sorry. Thank you, Mandalore Gaming. Thank you, MRIXRT, for Ubisoft. Why they're hated. I'm gonna like and sub to your channel. Thank you.
Ubisoft is one of those game companies that no one really has particularly strong feelings about. It's a multi-tentacled sea monster puppeting the corpses of half a dozen franchises while hiding its bulk underwater. However, as a company, Ubisoft has some significant issues that seem to be organizational, systemic, and pervasive. I don't know that they can be addressed with anything less drastic than a full divestment from the micromanaging and over-controlling Guillemot family and a removal of most of their current leadership. Since that's not going to happen, I'm going to try to catalog all of the issues with the company as it stands now, in hopes that one day they might be addressed satisfactorily. I have a small disclaimer here first. Ubisoft has sent me free games for reviews. They've sent me complimentary gifts. They've even donated games to be given away for a charity event I hosted for Child's Play charity a few years ago. And I currently have emails out to their PR team for statements on other ongoing videos. I have a relationship with Ubisoft, one which I intend to continue, and I also don't have any huge distaste for the company or the people who work there. I don't hate Ubisoft. None of that is to say that I intend to take it easy on Ubisoft. Even with all of this, it's just the fact that today's Ubisoft kinda sucks. I wish I didn't have to start this video with an immediately too real moment, but no video about Ubisoft in the current climate can fail to mention the accusations of misconduct and hostile workplace culture at Ubisoft. In 2020, in the middle of the pandemic and during the very public reckoning occurring at gaming companies left and right, Ubisoft was hit with accusations by French newspaper Libération against several C-level executives, including the chief creative officer, the head of Ubisoft Montreal, the co-founder of Ubisoft Toronto, the Assassin's Creed creative director, 2 vice presidents, and the global head of human resources. To their credit, Ubisoft immediately cut ties with all the named parties. They hired a new head of diversity and inclusion, hired a chief workplace officer, and they brought in an outside employee complaint review board. However, while all of this sounds like good, strong steps forward, employees at Ubisoft continue to make significant complaints and accusations against the company. And it's starting to look like maybe Ubisoft really isn't doing much of anything at all. Employees spoke to Kotaku and said that several of the known abusers at the company were promoted. Complainants were being sworn to secrecy about their complaints, and there's a strong lack of transparency in the company. According to many sources, during this entire time, a strong and open racism was also prevalent in the company, with Asian employees being told, "When you smile, you look like someone eating lemon," that "You Asians, you all look the same." And when it was reported to HR, those employees were being told that there was no chance of anything being done, since the people saying these bad things were directors who had been at the company for decades, or that complaints would just cause additional problems for the
BRB.
employee. That third-party review board appears to be where complaints go to quietly disappear as well, with employees saying that they have waited over a year for resolutions to issues, only to never receive any sort of feedback about whether issues were addressed at all, let alone resolved. During all this, Yves Guillemot, CEO at Ubisoft, has said, "I have always valued free expression at Ubisoft," and made noises that addressing issues are a priority, at the same time that his cousin, Ubisoft Canada CEO Christophe Doreen, has said, "Obviously, this does not prevent journalists from trying to contact you. If that happens, we ask that you forward the request to our media relations officer. It's the right thing to do. But it's also a commitment you made under the Code of Conduct, the anti-leak policy, and your employment contract. I could not write a better veiled threat that you will be fired for talking to journalists." Those who have risked being terminated to speak anonymously have said, "There's nothing more I can say about our demands or management's response to them because there's been nothing, no attempt to reach out, no new measures to meet them." This has led to a shockingly high number of resignations amongst top performers at Ubisoft.
Wow.
Axios reported that attrition at the company is 12% annually. And to put that into better terms,
I played Exo Primal and I was like, God damn it, there is so much promise here, but you ruined it. It was the same thing as Outriders. Squaresoft and Ubisoft are like dead. They're like dead companies. And we grew up with them and they were so good for 20 years, but they were good in the old generations. We need new gen people that are like, you know, taking a look at what's possible as opposed to what we've already done.
5 of the top 25 credited people from Far Cry 6 are already gone, and 12 of the top 50 from Valhalla have left. This has real-world effects on the games they're producing, as employees are now saying that it has led to stalls, delays, and cancellations. Ubisoft's reply, they're hiring 2,600 more interns and junior staff. So their staffing levels are actually still within industry norms. They also announced a pay raise of up to 20% more for senior staff and 5% more for junior staff. One of the issues at Ubisoft since then has been claims of increasing pay gaps amongst workers in a seemingly unforeseen consequence. Assault, racism, resignations, pay gaps. There is no neat wrap-up here, and I suspect there won't be for a long time. Probably the most common reason that Ubisoft shows up in news articles is because they are canceling a game. It's such a common trope that at this point I don't think anyone thinks Ubisoft games are real until they're released for 3 months. The list of canceled games is long and strong and includes games like Splinter Cell VR, Ghost Recon Frontline, Pioneer, Hyperscape, King Arthur, and more. And we're all waiting for news that Beyond Good and Evil 2, the Prince of Persia remake, The Division Heartland, Roller Champions, Oddballers, and Project Q have all been canceled too. Then there's the games that have been delayed, like Assassin's Creed Rift and Avatar Frontiers of Pandora. And pretty quickly it starts to appear like Ubisoft's slate of announced games is a whiteboard being wiped off as part of a joke. But at least you can go play the games that are already out, unless of course you want to play them online. Yes, Ubisoft slashed the multiplayer functionality out of over 100 games in the past few months, including any in-game rewards that were unlocked by the use of Uplay's unit points. Games like Anno 2070, Far Cry Blood Dragon, Space Junkies, Rainbow Six Vegas 2, and over 100 more are losing the ability to play multiplayer, the ability to log in or use any online features, the ability to redeem rewards.
This is why I'm PC Master Race, because most of those games on PC still do have multiplayer because of Steam. But yeah, like the like Rainbow Six Siege on the Xbox 360 or even higher Xbox One. That's sad. You can only play split screen anymore. You can't play online with your friends. And I know some people that really love that game and probably would play it again if they could online.
It's the ability to install and access deep game and more. Perhaps you caught where I said that included the ability to install and access DLC, and yes, you heard me correctly. As part of Ubisoft's cost-cutting attempts, strongly inferred by their desire to eliminate the online costs associated with non-profitable games, they have also chosen to eliminate the ability to play DLC you paid for. Games like Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, Driver San Francisco, Far Cry 3, Silent Hunter 5, and Prince of Persia: The Forgotten Sands will no longer allow you to download and play the DLC associated with the games. Only DLCs and online features will be affected by the upcoming decommissioning. Current owners of those games will still be able to access, play, or re-download them. Ubisoft sent out this statement as if to say, don't worry, yes, we're deleting the DLC you paid for, but at least you can still play the games without the DLC you paid for. Altogether, there are over 50 different games that you could have paid Ubisoft to play their DLC, which now, today, you cannot play. That's over 50 different times that Ubisoft bait and switched you, sold you something which they would later steal back from you, all under the guise that closing the online services for some older games allows us to focus our resources on delivering great experiences for players who are playing newer or more popular titles. Except, as we just talked about, they aren't releasing new games either, are they? NFTs, the blockchain, crypto. Over the past couple of years, Ubisoft has entangled themselves with all of it. Since 2019, Ubisoft has experimented with blockchains and NFTs at their Strategic Innovation Lab, an internal group that hires researchers and explores various technologies and how to gamify them. RTX, for example, or blockchain. This all came together in December 2021 when Ubisoft announced they would introduce NFTs into the PC version of Ghost Recon Breakpoint. And boy, people did not like that. Without going too deeply into the blockchain and its value or lack thereof, Ubisoft's implementation specifically was especially troublesome. The argument about why blockchains are so powerful is often surrounded by the word decentralization. However, Ubisoft's attempt was nothing if not centralized. It was so deeply controlled by Ubisoft that the only explanation is either they didn't understand blockchain or they expected that you wouldn't either. To explain a little bit, Ubisoft wanted to offer cosmetic skins, hats, guns, pants, each limited to a set number, with a serial number displayed on the blockchain and in-game, and metadata of the history of that specific skin. We've seen this sort of thing work, not with blockchain, but definitely with skins, especially in games like CSGO, where rare skins can sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars. It makes sense why Ubisoft might see that and want to get their hands into that money pile. The secondary market is often as large or larger than the primary market for any collectible, so owning that market is doubling your profit, hypothetically. However, those other implementations, such as on Steam, did so, as I mentioned, without blockchain. So why did Ubisoft want to use blockchain? And this is when decentralization would normally be bandied about, except that Ubisoft's implementation isn't decentralized at all. Instead, it's completely controlled by Ubisoft, and it has a lot of restrictions on it as well. You must be 18, you must be in an approved country, you must use two-factor authentication, and you must tie it to your Ubisoft Connect account. A centrally owned and controlled system subject to Ubisoft's terms and conditions. If you get banned, yeah, your NFTs are banned too, including on third-party marketplaces because they control your access to your account, which controls that access to those items on the blockchain. They even specifically say they will block transactions into your wallet if they choose to. That's the exact opposite of decentralized. Further, they only allow you to resell through specific third-party marketplaces they authorize and approve, which of course they take a fee through. All this while arguing that any scams, hacks, or threats are outside of their responsibility because thanks to the decentralization of blockchains, well, they just can't reverse or cancel transactions. None of the benefits, all of the problems, and additional hands in your pocket the whole way. What an incredibly awful implementation. And all this while offering NFTs that included none of the legal benefits of an NFT either. No, Ubisoft isn't giving up the right to create derivative works, to use the item in a video, to sell merchandise or fractionalized shares. No, they give you nothing because, again, Ubisoft owns these things and controls them, not you. So with that implementation, again, outside of the actual concerns many people have about the blockchain in the first place, what is the point and purpose of these NFTs except to generate passive income through secondary market sales? It would have been better to have this just be a regular DLC item, because at least that way you get protections from scams and hacks. Worse still is that Ubisoft tried to play this out as if it made your investment worth more, because, well, what if Ubisoft disappears? Your items live on in the blockchain, see? Except they are heavily restricted, centralized NFTs that ultimately are only useful inside of a Ubisoft game. What value does this NFT have if Ubisoft stops existing? The entire value proposition is literally that it's tied to a game that you want to play, that it's tied to a popular franchise, and you get to have this rare and unique skin. So there really is no longevity, no future, no outlasting Ubisoft. And again, either they didn't think about this, or they expected that you wouldn't either. So the NFTs lasted for about 4 months before Ubisoft quietly set the website into museum mode, and there hasn't been a single sale of a single item in over 6 months. But don't worry, Ubisoft has a statement to make. I think gamers don't get what a digital secondary market can bring to them. For now, because of the current situation and context of NFTs, gamers really believe it's first destroying the planet and second, just a tool for speculation. But what we at Ubisoft are seeing first is the end game. The end game is about giving players the opportunity to resell their items once they're finished with them, or they're finished playing the game itself. So it's really for them. It's really beneficial, but they don't get it for now. See, you don't get it, do you, gamer? How could you, stupid gamer, not understand this thing? You're so stupid. It's okay, though, because literally 1 week later, Ubisoft decided to gift all those hardworking developers working on Breakpoint a month's vacate. No, it was a free NFT, a hat. What's most interesting to me is that Ubisoft, when they announced this to their teams, said that if a developer wanted one, they would be automatically dropped into the developer's crypto wallet. And it made me wonder, is it required to give Ubisoft your wallet address in order to work there? I would literally never allow my employer access to see inside my wallet. What an epic series of missteps. Let's talk about that launcher. Uplay. Sorry, Ubisoft Club. Sorry, Ubisoft Connect.
Your skill has increased.
They changed the name a few times, you see, in a pretty transparent bid to distance themselves from the very negative connotations associated with Uplay. Let's just lay out the basics here. Ubisoft Connect, which I will continue to erroneously call Uplay, is a launcher similar to the Epic Games launcher or Steam, except that Uplay also launches whenever you launch the game from Epic or Steam. Yes, a second launcher that is launched when you launch the game from another launcher. This was all launched in a bid to increase Ubisoft's control over their game distribution, as well as increase profitability by forcing players to use Uplay and therefore be more likely to actually buy something in Uplay. For those of you who are unaware, Steam takes 30% of a game's sales and Epic takes 12%. So every sale Ubisoft can convince you to make inside of Uplay is worth up to 40% more than the same purchase made through Steam. This is exactly why we have EA's Origin, Activision Blizzard's Battle.net, Epic's Epic Game Store, GOG's Galaxy, the now defunct Bethesda BethNet launcher, and yes, Ubisoft's Ubisoft Connect. Now, Uplay has gotten a lot better over the years, and I'll tell you how bad it was for a very long time, but it's still not a great platform. The store is difficult to browse, it commonly doesn't even work to the point that sometimes you can't even spend money through it, it crashes, it closes games on you, it launches user access control every single time it updates. It's not a pretty thing. Worse still is when it simply breaks and a game becomes unplayable, as happened to a lot of players when Far Cry 6 was released. Ubisoft Connect simply didn't. Connect, that is. It would fail to authorize, it would fail to sync, it would even forget you owned the game
the one thing
and
it
ask if you
doesn't
wanted to
do.
pay for it again. When you did get it to work, the Uplay overlay caused so much lag and stutter that the recommended solution was to completely disable it. Ubisoft is not going to get rid of Ubisoft Connect, however, and in fact are doubling down
why
on
would
its
they? They
mandated
need to double
usage
down.
with their recent push
Double
towards
down on that failure.
silent key activation. I'm going to give you a quick rundown on this process. When you buy a game from a retailer, they have an Excel spreadsheet with thousands of keys for that game, and they just copy and paste one over to you. It's a bit smarter and a bit more automated than that, but that's how it works. With silent key activation, the retailer doesn't get that list of keys. Instead, the retailer records a sale and then passes that on to a middleman who also records the sale, and then you log into your Uplay account, and that third party activates the game
why
on
Assassin's
your
Creed is
account. That means there's
$70.
no game keys anymore. Ubisoft obviously
Yay.
loves this for several reasons. First,
'Cause
they
you'll have to
control
buy more
100%
copies.
of the distribution of the game. If a retailer doesn't obey Ubisoft, they can be immediately and irrevocably removed from the sales process. Secondly, they can control pricing. No longer can someone buy the key at a lower price and then sell it on the gray market later. The lowest available price is always a brand new key from Ubisoft. Thirdly, it stops a kind of fraud that almost certainly didn't exist, where a retailer would lie about when they sold a game key in order to claim that those sales occurred during a reduced price period. If this occurred, the retailer could skim additional revenue off the top. This kind of direct entitlement is something Ubisoft really wants to be industry standard, because it gives all the control to the publisher. This, however, has one side effect that no one seems to want to talk about, which is that it relies on Uplay working correctly. Since there is no game key, you cannot sell a physical product. Literally cannot sell a physical PC game. In fact, that's on purpose. And Ubisoft and their partners see this as a great thing because, again, it means control of the sales channel and control over the price. It still means that Uplay has to work correctly every single time. It's not hard to imagine a situation where Uplay just doesn't work right, and your money disappears into the ether and no one can verify that you paid for the game. Even still, none of this would be a problem if not for the fact that Ubisoft has shown they have no interest in maintaining availability of games. Remember not so long ago in this very video where I talked about them removing DLC and online capabilities? Well, that's because it was all tied to Uplay. And if they didn't have Uplay tied into DLC activation and online play, you'd be able to keep playing those games and keep playing that DLC just fine. But no, we need Uplay. Today's media landscape is increasingly made up of fractious and competing services.
This is why I won't buy Far Cry
Netflix,
6.
Hulu, HBO Max, Peacock, Vib.
I was actually genuinely interested in Far Cry 6, but then I tried Exo Primal, and they were like, you have to install Ubisoft, and you have to do Uplay, and you have to give us all your information, and we are going to take your credit card and all this other shit. And I was like, no, I'm not going to buy Ubisoft anymore. Fuck Uplay. For some reason, Ubisoft never ever had that kind of goodwill with me. I liked Far Cry 1 and 2 and 3 and Primal Instincts. Actually, more like Far Cry 1 and 2. I didn't really like 3 very much. I thought it was a great game. I had a lot of respect for it, but I didn't play it a lot. And, you know, and I like Ubisoft. They've always been there for me. And Far Cry 1 really was a game changer for me. But, I mean, I don't, and in Crysis 1, Crysis 2, Crysis 3, all of them were good. I like Ubisoft, but I didn't like Assassin's Creed. And I haven't liked Ubisoft since Assassin's Creed. Now, Raving Rabbids was good. Really good, genuinely fucking perfect 10 game. Every second of it.
Vizio, Paramount Plus, Disney Plus, so many that you probably didn't immediately realize that Vizio was made up. Probably, it could be a real thing by now. Gaming is quickly following along, with its rocky start through Jump and Utomic and GeForce Now, through today with Amazon Luna, Apple Arcade, Google Stadia, Netflix Games, Nintendo Origin Access, Switch Online, PlayStation Plus, and of course, Xbox Game Pass and PC Game Pass. This is a growing business model for the industry, and it's become complementary to the normal distribution channels of digital and physical retailers. Ubisoft has their own subscription model as well, called Ubisoft Plus, which provides Ubisoft games for a monthly subscription. Ubisoft did a survey, and they found that 41% of gamers between 15 and 45 already subscribed to an online service like Xbox Live, PlayStation Network, or Nintendo Online, and a further 24% subscribed to either Xbox Game Pass, PlayStation.
Yeah, but those people had history with us for 20 years. So Sony, I liked Sony since 2003. Xbox, I like that since 2003 as well. Or whatever, since the PlayStation 1 and the original Xbox and shit, they've got 20 years of goodwill. So yeah, we'll join their store and let them sell us games like Valve. We trust them. Ubisoft had nowhere near that kind of goddamn clout. Nowhere near it. There was okay, Squaresoft had more clout like that, but I still hated it. I hated it and I wouldn't do their stores. And they have a lot more clout than Ubisoft. If Squaresoft can't even get enough clout for me to go to their fucking store, why would you think that I would do that for Ubisoft? Did you think that all the Assassin's Creed and I don't know, Rainbow Six guys are that brand? Fucking, that brand fucking, what's the word? Loyal? I don't think so. I don't think they're that brand loyal. I don't think they care. They're just looking for good games.
Now EA Play or some other subscription content service, and then 17% subscribed to both. For Ubisoft, this meant that they could pretty easily continue to increase their revenue, increase their share of that revenue, and increase their control over the games. It's a long-time truism that there's more profit in renting than selling, and while not everyone would consider subscribing to Ubisoft Plus, it was enough people that they felt it made sense. Ubisoft has a 30-year history of games, and they can offer all those games that might not be worth spending $10 each to play, but might be worth paying $10 to rent all of them. Additionally, Ubisoft has a mentality that their games do not replace themselves. For example, Assassin's Creed 4 does not replace Assassin's Creed 3. Unlike a live service game like Destiny or Overwatch, when a new Ghost Recon drops, the old game still holds a lot of value. There's a strong argument to be made that every Assassin's Creed is still playable and valuable. Plus, Ubisoft tends to release around 5 games a year, meaning that as long as it's priced competitively,
I disagree. I haven't been willing to touch Assassin's Creed since Assassin's Creed 2. And even then I had a tongue in the cheek and I was like, no, I don't think so. No. And I think Ubisoft has just been very good at supplying good games over the 20 years, yeah, but they went downhill.
Some sense to drop some money to, quote, save some money. Plenty of people are very happy to rent a game, play it, and then not have it anymore. This is the GameStop model, the Blockbuster model, the idea that you would pay less to get a new game knowing you're not going to own it in a few months. The problem is 3 things. First, this service only has Ubisoft games. Now, obviously, that's obviously. And in fact, I just gave a couple reasons why only Ubisoft isn't even that big of a problem. But it's still a concern for a lot of subscribers when you consider that the competition is something like PlayStation Now and Game Pass, both of which are going to present a lot of games from a lot of developers. While yes, Ubisoft Plus does offer over 100 games, 17 of them are Assassin's Creeds, 16 are Tom Clancy games, 8 are Far Cry, 6 are Anno, Heroes of Might and Magic, Rayman. Certainly, this has value for someone who really likes Assassin's Creed, or who really enjoys Watch Dogs. But it's not so much a Netflix-esque proposition where you have a wide and varied selection. Instead, it's like subscribing to Shudder, the premium streaming service with the best selection of horror, thriller, and supernatural movies and series, from Hollywood favorites and cult classics to original series and critically acclaimed new films you won't find anywhere else. Try a free trial for 7 days and experience the largest and fastest growing selection of new release and genre-defining classics. Check it out in the description. Unfortunately, if you're just not into Assassin's Creed, then you're probably not going to get as much value from Ubisoft Plus as you would from a more varied service. Second is biased subscription preference. Again, renting is more profitable than selling, so I want to encourage you to rent from me. That means I am incentivized to make rental look really good. That's why every Ubisoft Plus game includes all the DLC, all the upgrades, the premium of premium editions. Even if it's just a couple skins, just a handful of new missions, they can price a premium edition at an outrageous level, knowing full well that you do not intend to buy it. And if you do, great, they get some extra dosh, but it's intended to herd you into subscribing to Ubisoft Plus. Here, listen to this. Get monthly rewards throughout your journey in the Ubisoft Plus gaming subscription. Every month, enjoy your choice of different customization items, boosters, and more. Over time, progress through the ranks to increase your number of monthly choices and redeem more rewards. Redeem, accumulate, and keep your rewards. Even if you cancel your subscription, you get more content, you get more gameplay, you get an easier gameplay experience if you just subscribe instead of buying. Why would you ever buy a game? You can just pay for Ubisoft Plus and get the best version of the game. Plus, get all sorts of extra perks. There is no intention for you to buy the $120 Ultimate Edition of Far Cry 6. Sure, if you want to, great, give us the profit. But really, we want you to see how much extra stuff you get for subscribing to Ubisoft Plus. Third is price. Ubisoft Plus is the most expensive gaming subscription at $15 or $18 a month, depending on your tier. Stadia,
You guys are
Luna,
the worst one.
EA Play, all $10 a month. PlayStation Plus is $10, $15, or $18. Xbox Game Pass is $10 or $15 a month, depending on tier. That means that Ubisoft Plus is competing at a premium monthly price directly with Xbox Game Pass
I haven't looked at
Ultimate,
Game Pass
PC
in a
Game
while.
Pass
Let's go
Ultimate,
look
and
at it.
PlayStation Plus Premium, while being more expensive than Stadia, Luna, EA Play, GeForce Now, Apple Arcade, Nintendo Switch Online, and the lowest tiers of Xbox and PlayStation. Expanding that out, it's more expensive than Netflix, than Spotify, than Amazon Prime. You could get one of those subscription boxes every month for less money. And if I'd had access to those, I would have put that affiliate shout out a minute ago here, encouraging you to buy a box of knives or whatever it is. No, Netflix isn't the same, but Netflix views gaming as a bigger threat to their platform than HBO, and for a reason. It's all about attention. So yeah, they're similar. They're going after the same people. And in a world where every single entertainment conglomerate wants access to your wallet on a monthly basis, it's really hard to say that of the 3 subscriptions you'll maintain every month, one of them should be Ubisoft Plus. Live service, games as a service, living game, live service game, they all mean the same thing. Always online, drip-fed content that players are meant to log into for several hours a week, forever. Daily quests, weekly quests, raids, new missions, remixing old content. Bring your own fun. It makes sense, don't get me wrong.
Games aren't
Live service games generate tens of billions of dollars a year. In fact, EA, in May of 2022, admitted that 71% of the entire company's revenue came from live service games such as Apex Legends and FIFA Ultimate Team. Sony bought Bungie and then immediately announced they were working on 12 live service games. They make bucks. Ubisoft has been working on live service games since 2013, when it announced that they wouldn't even start making a game if they couldn't turn it into a franchise. They doubled down on this and started suggesting that players would never have to buy DLC again because Ubisoft
Halo
would
Wars
only
2.
charge for
Wow.
cosmetics like trinkets and charms, skins, but not the characters themselves. A quick digression, this was not true. However, it did show how Ubisoft was thinking. Games are to be live services. Service is the key word here. Much like Ubisoft Plus, there's more value in renting than selling, and if we can rent you access to a game that itself is constantly changing, then you can never ever complete it. You can't get enough, you can't be done. We're renting you the experience and renting you access to it. So you have to keep renting forever and ever and ever. Enter Assassin's Creed Infinity, which, if you haven't heard, is the new Assassin's Creed game, and it'll be the last Assassin's Creed game because they'll update it forever and ever. Rather than continuing to pass the baton from game to game, we profoundly believe this is an opportunity for one of Ubisoft's most beloved franchises to evolve into a more integrated and collaborative manner that's less centered on studios and more focused on talent and leadership, no matter where they are within Ubisoft. Infinity is years away still, but likely not to be any singular game, but instead a platform, a live service platform, continually updated with new content, and launching from that, multiple experiences that tie together and unify. An interactive hub world like Destiny or any other MMO. And then, of course, monetized like one, probably with a battle pass. We'll see this shift after Assassin's Creed Rift, the spin-off of Valhalla, but the goal for Ubisoft here is forever. One game updated forever with non-stop money rolling in. That Fortnite cash that Ubisoft is always going to be upset they missed out on. And finally, in this video about a video game company, we get to the part where I can
they
talk
just took a
about
swing with
the actual
with the Dino game, and that game was so cheesy. But I liked it. It was fun. It was like a bad Overwatch, but I mean, it was like Smite. It was kind of jokey, you know? It was so over the top and dumb. And it was fun to play, but it wasn't a game I could see playing like every day. Oh yeah, I gotta go south to get to the dark cluster and make my money. I don't want to aggro that bat eye. Just want to go downstairs. Yeah.
Games. I'm going to describe something to you, and I'd really enjoy hearing from you in the comments if this is something that you've experienced. You start up a new game. It opens with some big, spectacular action set piece. You're introduced to all the new characters, handheld and guided through your new home base with your new friends, and then introduced to a high point and a map, and the many icons on it that start to pop up immediately. Enemy bases, loot spots, puzzles, fetch quests, and hidden sections of the map that once you get there will also unlock new icons on the map. Bases, loot, puzzles, fetch quests. And then you feel the weight, the listlessness. You know already what the entire game plays like, because you've played this same game already, maybe many times. You've climbed the tower, you've sent out your bird, you've pinged the server, and all of those things sent out a wave on a map and highlighted new icons, a never-ending cycle.
It's all the triple anus. They just want to give us the same bullshit that they did 20 years ago, and if we'll swallow it, they'll sell it, they'll do it. You know, they don't care. Tando, stab, kill. Oh, someone got my elemental? There's no way. Somebody already got this elemental. Oh, damn it. Damn it. Alright, well, let's sit here and wait for the sound of it to pop, maybe. Yeah, right. I don't know why that's off, but okay. I made so much money today. Like 130 million or something.
Of climb, icon, repeat, bases, loot, puzzles, fetch quests. I call this Ubisoft fatigue, and specifically Ubisoft and not open world, because while Far Cry 3 has certainly proven itself one of the most influential open world games, there are others that are also common. Skyrim clones, GTA clones, and Breath of the Wild clones. Each of those other three mother games represents a different kind of experience in the open world, and Ubisoft clones have a very specific feel. You can probably think back to the last Ubisoft game you put down and didn't pick up again and feel the Ubisoft fatigue.
Yep,
I find it remarkable how a company with so many different kinds of games can manage to make them all feel so incredibly similar, so cookie cutter and unremarkable. Watch Dogs is Assassin's Creed, is Ghost Recon, is Far Cry. They are so incredibly samey. It speaks to their artist's skill that people don't immediately open the newest Ubisoft game churned out from the factory and immediately check the title to see if this is DLC for a game they've already played. At one point, being overwhelmed by massive open world maps with random, disconnected, unfun and non-engaging activities was a sign that the world was somehow alive and that you weren't the protagonist. The world had its own flow without you. Now, it just feels like filling up a progress bar to the next tired iteration. This game has been done before. That's the feeling, the Ubisoft fatigue, these map-clearing simulators. Burnt out and disinterested players rushing through the final few missions as a sort of sunken cost fallacy. It is with that feeling that I hear the words from Ubisoft when they announce their new Scalar technology. Scalar is a streaming technology for developers that theoretically will allow them to make games that are hundreds, thousands of times larger, using cloud computing to reduce dependency on players' hardware. Managing director Patrick Bach said, "We can now build even bigger worlds for players to play." And I feel fatigued. He says they want to build something big, and I feel fatigued. As you've seen, besides being French, there are all sorts of issues with Ubisoft, but that doesn't really seem to matter to Ubisoft.
What's wrong with being French? Nothing.
From removing paid-for DLC, ruining open-world gaming, the assaults, the NFTs, and even the things I didn't talk about, like the Ubisoft theme park in Kuala Lumpur, which is expected to open in 2025.
Oh my god, are you
and the
serious?
Huge misstep of asking
Kuala
for fans
Lumpur.
to write music for Watch Dogs Legion.
Who the fuck is going to go to Kuala Lumpur to a theme park for Ubisoft? Kuala Lumpurians? Because, yeah, I don't know. I guess there must be a lot more business out there than I thought. But I mean, like, who the fuck? I mean, alright.
On speculation in a lottery to maybe win $2,000, and yet with all of these issues, Ubisoft still doesn't want to actually fix anything. Some of these issues I've brought up have existed for years and have seen almost no movement whatsoever. The market does seem to notice, however, as sales are down at Ubisoft 9.8% in the first quarter of 2022 and down 4% year over year. Gamers are getting fatigued by the issues at Ubisoft, the games, the launchers, the DLC problems. People are tired of Ubisoft screwing up. I understand. That's why I made this video. I am also really tired of Ubisoft screwing up. I love The Division. It's my favorite Ubisoft game by several miles. And boy, they just keep trying to turn it into a battle royale. Well, I just want The Division 3 in the snow. But I don't see the Guillemot brothers stepping down anytime soon, and I don't see how these structural issues can be addressed with them running everything. However, there is a light in the tunnel. Tencent, the biggest game company in the world, is trying to buy the Guillemots out. They are offering twice what the stock value is. And while a $10 billion acquisition initially sounds high, in today's post-Activision, post-Zynga, post-Bungie, post-Embracer world, it almost sounds quaint. I won't say that a buyout would definitely make things better, but it would at least introduce the opportunity, and Ubisoft could certainly use that. The staff, the games, could use a break from the fatigue. Thanks to my patrons who made this video possible, and I'll see you on the next one.
In 1998, at the Tokyo Fantastic International Film Festival, two men found themselves.
Oh, I remember now. There is a game that I want in the background. I think it's just sort of big and hard to keep on your drive. But there's a game that I want. Star Ocean. The Last Hope 4K for $20.99. Yeah, I want to view it. Yeah, and then I want to see if you will let me add this to your wish list. Yeah. Mixed review. I like this game though. I thought it was okay. Yep. Yep. I liked this stupid game for some reason. Second story R. Okay. Second story R. Second story. I pulled it up right away. $50, right? Yeah, wasn't this one really good? Overwhelmingly positive, yeah. One of the best JRPGs of all time. Oh, I didn't get back to the I didn't get back to the Dark Elemental. I mean, I don't think it probably popped in time anyways. Damn it, you stupid. Yeah. Wait, I just compressed. What are you talking about? Compress, damn it. $60 more million.
next to each other while queuing to see John Carpenter's Vampires. Now, unfortunately, there was a problem with the cinema's equipment, and so to pass the time, they struck up a conversation and discovered that they had a considerable amount in common. They both worked in the video game industry. They were both writer-directors and had both been on a run of successful releases that were starting to pick up steam outside of Japan. As the hours passed by, they debated storytelling and direction, traded ideas about the films that inspired them, and even joked that they would one day create a game together. After 8 long hours standing outside the Shibuya Parthenon, the cinema finally opened its doors. But for both men, it wasn't the film that they'd waited for, but this chance encounter that would make the night so memorable. This is a story that was told by Konami's Hideo Kojima and Squaresoft's Yasumi Matsuno while giving an interview together in 1999. The two were talking about how important cinema was in the creation of their respective games, and jokingly used that night in Tokyo as an example of just how different they felt they were from the rest of the industry. Now, when talking about Hideo Kojima, that all goes without saying. The man has created some of the most captivating video games ever made, enjoys a legacy 3 decades long, and remains as relevant in high definition as he was back in the world of 16-bit graphics. He's a legend of the industry. But what about the other man in that anecdote? What about Yasumi Matsuno? In that very same interview, Kojima described him as someone who could push the industry to exciting new places, someone who shared his design DNA, and yet, as of 2023, Yasumi Matsuno hasn't written or directed a full console title in over 20 years. The sad tale of his career is one of the industry's greatest tragedies, but in order to understand how he fell from such lofty acclaim, we're going to have to explore the strange history of his final completed game, Vagrant Story. Just like its creator, Matsuno's console swan song was at one time considered one of the finest video games in its class, an exceptional achievement in fantasy storytelling, RPG system design, and cinematic art direction, the shining conclusion to Squaresoft's storied PlayStation 1 catalogue. And yet, again, just like its creator, it's endured 20 years of silence and neglect, left behind while its siblings receive remake after remaster after remake, with any trace of its former glory found only in quiet whispers in some forgotten corner of the internet. Well, today our two protagonists will receive the redemption they deserve. This is the story of both Ashley Riot and Yasumi Matsuno, one in Tokyo and the other in Leamond, one wielding the pen and the other the sword, both desperately deserving of the acclamation that time and distance have stripped away. This is a lengthy Vagrant Story retrospective, and now the slowest dance can begin. It may be a YouTube retrospective cliche, but in order to properly fathom both the creation of Vagrant Story and the events that led to Matsuno's departure from frontline development, we need to understand him as a person, and that requires turning back the clock to 1965. Yasumi Matsuno was born to a middle-class family in rural Japan, and from a young age he'd been singularly obsessed with storytelling. He'd spend hours devouring every comic and novel he could get his hands on, watching and rewatching movies that his parents brought home, and indulging in his favourite pastime, making dioramas of battlefields with history books borrowed from the local library. This powerful imagination meant that when he discovered his first arcade in the late 1970s, he immediately fell in love with the world of video games, and spent hours destroying aliens and space invaders and piloting starships in Xevious. Now, this is where I'd usually tell you that this passion caused him to head off and study computer science before joining a big Japanese developer, but that is surprisingly not the way this story goes. Matsuno loved playing games and writing stories, but it was very much a hobby, and at the age of 18, he enrolled at the University of Hosei in Tokyo, where he studied the decidedly non-creative foreign policy. Now, eventually he did drop out in order to pursue a career as a writer, but it proved much harder than he'd imagined, and for most of the 1980s, Matsuno worked at a big news corporation, where he produced articles about international politics. It was deeply unsatisfying stuff, and he found himself increasingly turning to video games for escapism, spending most of his nights exploring the worlds of Dragon Quest and The Legend of Zelda, trying to forget about the rigid and structured workplace that denied his storytelling soul. Well, in 1989, everything changed. After seeing an advertisement for a video game scriptwriting job, Matsuno took a chance and applied. Incredibly, despite having zero experience within the industry, he was accepted. Just like that, the dreary corporate career ended, and he found himself forging characters and worlds in a medium that he loved. Now, the company that had hired Matsuno was called Quest, and very quickly he became an important team member, contributing large amounts of work to Quest's next release. This was 1990's Conquest of the Crystal Palace, which, despite looking like a bog-standard Japanese NES platformer, actually offers a few hints of what's to come. Matsuno was credited as both a writer and designer, and I feel like you can see his influence in both of these areas, as the game is far more ambitious than it has any right to be. We play as Farron, a young warrior who discovers that he's the prince of the Crystal Palace. The game consists of 5 levels where we fight to beat back the forces of darkness and liberate his ancestral home. On the surface, it's nothing that original, but in what would become Matsuno's signature move, he spent countless hours constructing the game's narrative, and it ended up far more complex than most other 8-bit titles. The manual contains 2 pages of detailed backstory, and throughout the game, there are news reports that update the player on the state of the kingdom and the fallout from their adventures. By NES standards, this was positively cinematic, but the complexity didn't end there, as Matsuno and fellow designer Takaharu Mita dreamt up all manner of ways to keep the simple gameplay engaging. Before you start your adventure, you can choose between 3 unique builds that each play differently, and in between levels, Farron visits a shop full of upgrades and spells where you can spend money gained from defeating enemies. There are optional bosses, hidden items, and even an entire set of mechanics that revolve around a magical dog called Zap, and it adds up to so much more than just an action platformer. When it was released, it was successful enough to warrant an English language translation, and while sales were pretty modest in comparison to the likes of Zelda and Mario, for Quest, it was their biggest hit by some distance. Within less than a year, Matsuno had become a crucial cog in the machine, and thanks to his work on Conquest of the Crystal Palace, the directors promoted him to the company's creative lead, and gave him free rein to design whatever he wanted next. Now, even at this early point in his career, Matsuno was looking to do business differently, and in interviews years later, he spoke about how, instead of chasing reviews or sales, his team was singularly focused on creating something unique. This philosophy led to the release of Ogre Battle: The March of the Black Queen in March 1993
Ogre Battle:
for the
The March of
SNES, and just like
Black
Conquest of
Queen,
the Crystal
wow.
Palace, it pushed Quest to a whole new level. Given Matsuno's main strengths were in world building, story writing, and system design, the obvious next step was to create a role-playing game. But he didn't want to compete with Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy, and so the team ended up taking those ideas in a very different direction. Where RPGs typically had you micromanaging characters and exploring dark caves, everything in Ogre Battle operates on a much grander scale. Inspired by titles like Fire Emblem and Nobunaga's Ambition, the game's levels represent entire continents, and players are expected to control up to 20
Ogre Battle was
battalions
not
of wizards, knights, and archers.
Ogre Battle was not inspired by Fire Emblem. Fire Emblem is
Now, while the
inspired
moment
by Ogre
gameplay
Battle.
revolves around nothing more than moving soldiers and watching battles, there's far more going on here than at first glance. Instead of quick reactions, the game is based on thoughtfully planning ahead and juggling a monstrous amount of systems that govern your army's strength. You have to carefully manage squad formations to get the best out of different soldiers, decide which classes your squads should be made up of, liberate cities in order to get items and powerful battle cards, and manipulate the alignment of your army, which affects if it's strong in the day or at night. And that's all on top of traditional RPG ideas like acquiring new gear and leveling up. It's a hell of a lot to get your head around, but the depth it creates is highly impressive. And considering RTS games on PC were still in their infancy, the team at Quest deserves a lot of credit for making it work with a console and controller. Now, while all this made Ogre Battle extremely distinct to play, its most unique element was unsurprisingly its storytelling, as Matsuno was able to leverage his background as an international journalist and create a world that felt like a reflection of our own. Rather than mimicking the Chosen One stories that dominated other SNES RPGs, Matsuno crafted a tale of bloody revolution within a repressive empire and tried to make the world of Zetagenia as realistic as he could. Different regions believe in different interpretations of the world's mythology, and characters all have conflicting political opinions, which in turn prompt player choices about who they should align with. All these choices lead to an amazing 13 different endings, and this combination of creating a highly detailed world but allowing the player to express themselves within it, well, it made Ogre Battle very popular in hardcore RPG circles. Now, if games were judged solely on their ambition alone, Ogre Battle would go down as a stone-cold classic, but ironically, for all of its complex gameplay and interlocking storytelling, most of the critical acclaim centered around its presentation, with outlets like EGM and Nintendo Power gushing over its high-quality graphics and sound. During development, Matsuno formed a really strong relationship with two artists called Hiroshi Minagawa and Akihiko Yoshida, who both handled art direction and character design. The three found working together extremely easy, and this made for a relaxed atmosphere where people could experiment and feel listened to by management. The same was true of the game's soundtrack, which was handled by another duo, Hitoshi Sakamoto and Masaharu Iwata. The two were deeply talented musicians, but didn't have many games under their belt, something that would have usually meant years of assisting before getting to produce their own soundtrack. As something of an outsider himself, Matsuno was happy to look past this and let the two run wild, with his faith repaid with an excellent cinematic score that perfectly suits the themes of warfare and betrayal. These 5 developers, Matsuno, Minagawa, Yoshida, Sakamoto and Iwata, were really the heart and soul of Quest Corporation, and thanks to their ridiculously high standard of work, Ogre Battle was picked up by RPG giant Enix and published worldwide to much higher sales than expected. In interviews years later, Matsuno talked about how the team decided that they'd be happy with just 100,000 units shipped, but within a few months they got news that Ogre Battle had sold 500,000 units. Within a few years it was ported to the PlayStation 1 and the Sega Saturn, and amidst rave reviews in both Japanese and English, it was clear that they'd not only created a hit, but a bona fide classic. Where Quest was once almost entirely unknown outside of Japan, they now had Nintendo begging them to
Yeah, we went nuts for Tactics, but the game that I think of is Final Fantasy Tactics.
Although it was once again not.
You know, I haven't played that game in 15 years or something, and that was on the PlayStation 1, I think. God, that's a great game, but I don't think you can get it. Yeah, I don't think they remade Tactics for PC, but maybe. Final Fantasy Tactics, right? War of the Lions didn't come to PC. It's unfortunate. Yep, Final Fantasy Tactics did not come to PC. It's sad. Wait, there's a game that I kind of want. this isn't it. Where is this stupid thing? Oh, no. What's this? Oh, my tiger like died or despawned or something. I should have bought tigers while I was there. Oh well. And towards the end of the shift here, got like half an hour.
What the follow-up people expected. Apparently influenced by how Ridley Scott had followed up Alien with the markedly different Aliens, Matsuno decided that Quest's next major title should be a similar reinvention.
Yeah,
and instead of simply building on the foundation of Ogre Battle, his team once again aimed to make something entirely unique. With a much higher budget and over 2 years of development time, they plunged into the creation of Tactics Ogre: Let Us Cling Together, which was eventually released in 1995 on the Super Nintendo, and similarly made enormous waves in the industry. The most obvious differences were the change in scale and perspective, as instead of a real-time pulled-back strategy game, Tactics Ogre took the player much closer to the battlefield and asked them to play out isometric grid-based skirmishes that functioned like an RPG version of chess. Now this change was apparently driven by Minagawa, who is a huge fan of the NES game Solstice, but it's also hard to imagine that Matsuno's childhood love of creating historical dioramas didn't also play a big role. Regardless of where it came from, the change was inspired, and thanks to the new perspective, things like elevation, positioning and terrain could play a much bigger role, and this meant that Tactics Ogre had a lot more depth despite having fewer units on screen. That same dynamic is true of the RPG systems, as while you no longer manage an entire army, each individual party member can be deeply customized, with almost 20 unique classes to unlock, which each bring a massive amount of utility. There are dragoons and berserkers, warlocks and necromancers, gunsmiths and ninjas, alongside beast tamers that can subjugate monsters, and a whole host of unique characters that you can recruit in limited circumstances. With an elemental alignment system that can boost or reduce damage, and a loyalty gauge that changes based on actions you take in the story, it's substantially more complex than Ogre Battle. But thanks to the reduced scale, it never feels overwhelming, and your progression is always clear and obvious. Now, while these gameplay changes were very well received, and the art and sound design once again delivered at a very high level, it was Matsuno's storytelling that stole the show, and saw his writing and ambition reach a whole new level. Rather surprisingly, Tactics Ogre wasn't a direct sequel, with Matsuno telling journalists that while the two games would both contribute to the overall Ogre Battle saga, they were taking place in different parts of Zetagenia at different times. Now, this love of creating multiple stories within the same world would also become a hallmark of Matsuno's later work, but here it was primarily driven by him wanting to create a different kind of story, one that was less fantastical and much darker in tone. As a student of international politics, he'd been deeply influenced by events happening around the world, and sadly, the early 1990s were characterized by brutal warfare in Eastern Europe during the collapse of Yugoslavia. Horrified by what he saw in the news, Matsuno found himself penning a story that leaned even harder into murky moral relativism, telling a heartbreaking tale of a kingdom disintegrating and the consequences for the people that call it their home, dealing with topics like ethnic cleansing, racism, class warfare and nationalism. It was a million miles from the cartoon stylings that dominated the genre and earned Quest a lot of plaudits for dealing with such heavy subject matter. Now, unfortunately, as much as this ambition made Tactics Ogre into such a special game, it also proved to be something of a hindrance, as the team found the development process to be very challenging, and had to cut lots of features as the years ticked by and Nintendo and Quest piled on the pressure for a finished game. Originally, Matsuno had wanted to have a completely free-form narrative that reacted constantly to the player's choices, but this had to be stripped back as deadlines approached, and the team had to focus on finishing all the animations and graphical effects. Sadly, it also ended up impacting the game's sales, as Tactics Ogre was released very late in the SNES's life cycle, managing to release after the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation had hit the market. Its fantastic reviews and obvious quality still meant that it shipped 500,000 units, but with players being dazzled by the burgeoning world of 3D gaming, it was less than Matsuno and Quest had hoped for, and meant that ports had to be hastily thrown together in order to keep copies moving. Considering what an artistic and cinematic achievement Tactics Ogre was, Matsuno was deeply frustrated with its release, and in particular found himself clashing with Quest leadership over his management style and creative ambition. Just as dissatisfaction had reared its head back when he was a journalist, in 1995 those same feelings were bubbling up. And so incredibly, Yasumi Matsuno took a giant leap into the unknown and quit Quest with immediate effect. So just like in the Ogre Battle saga, our next chapter begins in a different time, with an entirely different cast of characters. On the other side of Tokyo to Quest lay the headquarters of Squaresoft, and within their mighty walls, another legendary developer was busy making his own mark on the role-playing genre. This was Hironobu Sakaguchi, and under his leadership, Final Fantasy had become a sensation of a franchise, second only to Dragon Quest in Japan, and easily the most popular RPG series outside of it. By the mid-1990s, Squaresoft had released 6 highly acclaimed entries, but as another example of a developer obsessed with creativity and invention, Sakaguchi constantly pushed his teams to experiment outside of Square's golden goose. This led to the release of classic games like Live Alive, Chrono Trigger, Front Mission, and Secret of Mana. But while all of these were highly acclaimed, what Sakaguchi dreamt of was a Square-produced strategy game. You see, he was a huge fan of Nintendo's Fire Emblem, and in an interview with Famitsu in 1994, he claimed it was his favourite franchise, often playing it all through the night and queuing up for hours every time a new game was released. He was so passionate about the genre that in 1992 he'd registered the trademark for Final Fantasy Tactics. But as the mainline Final Fantasy series became increasingly popular, he found himself with no time to transform his dream into a reality. So this brings us back to 1995 and the next stage in the career of Yasumi Matsuno. Now most people seem to think that Sakaguchi headhunted Matsuno and poached him from Quest, but both men have confirmed that this was not the case in several interviews. In fact, after Matsuno left Quest, he'd simply looked at which companies were hiring, and after seeing that Squaresoft were looking for planners, he'd applied and been accepted. Now obviously he didn't stay as a planner for very long, and once Sakaguchi caught wind of the company's new hire, Matsuno found himself in the executive vice president's office being shown the design document for Final Fantasy Tactics. By Matsuno's own account, a Final Fantasy strategy game was his dream project, and after begging Sakaguchi to put him in charge, he once again found himself helming a major project mere weeks after joining a new company. Now despite all this, the rumours of headhunting likely do have some truth in them, as very quickly the Final Fantasy Tactics team began to fill up with ex-Quest developers. There isn't any clear timeline for this, but we do know that Minagawa, Yoshida, Sakamoto and Iwata all joined Squaresoft that same year, and for all intents and purposes, Final Fantasy Tactics was a spiritual successor to Tactics Ogre, as it was developed by the very same team. Along with the staff, it shared the same isometric grid-based perspective, the same class-based progression system, and the same focus on gritty realism over high fantasy. In fact, it was shaping up to be so similar that Sakaguchi asked Final Fantasy VI director Hiroyuki Ito to join the team as a designer in order to make sure that Tactics felt like a part of the series that it took its name from. Ito proved to be an interesting addition to the team, as he didn't actually like strategy RPGs, and essentially spent the entire development cycle trying to balance out Matsuno's inclination towards hardcore system-driven gaming. In Ito's own words, he wanted tactics to feel swashbuckling and exciting, and this clash of ideals ended up producing something very special. As I've already mentioned, Final Fantasy Tactics is largely based on the Tactics Ogre formula, but it does make some key changes that in my view elevate the experience to a whole new level. For starters, the number of controllable characters has been reduced, and this increases the focus on party building, which is made all the more enjoyable as the class system is basically lifted from Final Fantasy V. Instead of having to progress through the story in order to unlock new moves and jobs, it's all done on your own terms, and heavily rewards players that want to experiment and find interesting combinations. Another big change is that Final Fantasy Tactics was released on the PlayStation 1 rather than the Super Nintendo, and this meant that Matsuno's team had access to much more storage than they were used to. Now, most of Squaresoft's PlayStation games use this to load up on ambitious CGI cutscenes, but surprisingly, Tactics doesn't contain all that many, and instead, most of the additional space was given over to Sakamoto and Iwata for the game's soundtrack. At first, both were intimidated by having to live up to the legendary work of Nobuo Uematsu, but once again, by closely working with Matsuno, they produced another wonderful OST that proved to be so popular that Square began selling it as a separate CD album. Combined with Yoshida's distinctive characters and Minagawa's eye for sprite and environmental design, Final Fantasy Tactics was essentially the culmination of everything Quest had been building towards. And nowhere is this more clear than in the writing of Yasumi Matsuno. Much like in the gameplay, he decided to really sharpen his storytelling, and while Tactics still involves numerous morally questionable factions, a raging transcontinental war and dark conspiracies bubbling under the surface, it's actually a far more human story than he'd ever previously penned. Everything revolves around two men, Ramza and Delitia, childhood friends who find themselves in ideological opposition about how to save their homeland of Evilis from the rot at the heart of its society. In true Final Fantasy fashion, there's a big chunk of supernatural darkness, but the vast majority of the intrigue comes from the clash between these two men, both trying to do what they believe is right and struggling to deal with the consequences of each other's actions. Just like in Tactics Ogre, this dark and realistic spin on the traditional JRPG formula works extremely well. But Matsuno took things a step further and added a fascinating framing device where the whole game is being told as if it's a recently discovered historical document. Once again taking influence from real-world events, he was inspired by the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and how important historical figures and events can be so easily lost to time. It all gives Evilis and the Zodiac Brave story a feeling of real scale, like it has a history that spans both into the past and future, perfectly expressing the maximalist style that he'd been developing since he first entered the industry. On release in 1997, Final Fantasy Tactics was a critical hit, garnering rave reviews in both English and Japanese, and quickly outselling anything that the team from Quest had ever worked on. Aided by the runaway popularity of the Final Fantasy name, by the end of the year it had sold 1.5 million copies and been nominated for a slew of awards, essentially confirming Matsuno as one of the industry's brightest rising stars and giving Sakaguchi the strategy RPG that he'd always wanted. Now, time has been a little harsher to Square's tactical masterpiece, and its glowing reputation has slowly given way to quite a bit of criticism. Despite Hiroyuki Ito's best endeavours, Matsuno was still able to pour a lot of complexity into the gameplay, and much of it is now seen as not actually adding much to the overall experience. Esoteric systems like the Brave and Faith stats, and each character having one of 12 Zodiac alignments, all feel quite poorly explained, and it can make for a game that doesn't always do a good job of telling players what's important and what isn't. On top of this, Tactics also has some of the most notorious difficulty spikes in RPG history, with one fight in particular requiring players to restart the game if they build Ramza in an incorrect way and save at just the wrong moment. These days, it's thought of as more of a cult classic, the perfect expression of a niche genre, but not something that would ever appeal to mainstream gamers or tempt in those that weren't already interested.
Tactics was amazingly
The thing is,
popular.
these opinions would take years
with
to
a
ferment,
lot of people.
and in the mid-1990s, Final Fantasy Tactics was simply seen as another top-notch release from a company and director that were quickly taking over the industry. So with Sakaguchi's desire for a strategy RPG finally satisfied, and Matsuno and the boys from Quest established as a major division within Squaresoft, the obvious question was where they went next. Well, the answer is the main course of this video. Yasumi Matsuno's masterpiece and the last game he would ever see to completion. Vagrant Story. During the development of Final Fantasy Tactics, Sakaguchi had been very impressed by Matsuno's management skills, and this proved to be rather timely, as thanks to the impending release of Square's first movie, Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, he needed directors that he could trust to produce quality games without his input. After Matsuno's impressive work just months after joining the company, Sakaguchi felt confident that his team could be left to their own devices. So a meeting was called, and Matsuno and the key developers from Final Fantasy Tactics got together to hash out their next adventure. Very quickly it became clear that the idea of making Final Fantasy Tactics 2 didn't really appeal to anyone, and instead it was decided that they should create something entirely new, and entirely 3D. Now it's not hard to imagine that it was Yasumi Matsuno driving this direction, and in an interview called From the Development Team, which Square released during Vagrant Story's marketing, he explained his thought process in a little more detail. To him, the idea of constantly reusing characters and endlessly producing similar sequels was utterly abhorrent, and he felt that it showed a disrespect for the artistic potential of video games. They were strong words, but Matsuno went even further when describing his vision for Vagrant Story. He claimed it would both appeal to hardcore system-driven gamers, but would also have the cinematic accessibility of a movie. It would be a game that defied characterization, leaping between genres and styles, and born out of what he called spontaneous, natural development. The vision of a team creating for the love of the medium, rather than to satisfy marketers or to hit sales goals. He capped everything off with a metaphor that takes us back to that night at the Shibuya Parthenon. If Final Fantasy is a Hollywood blockbuster, Vagrant Story is an artistic, independent movie, to be watched in a small theatre and truly remembered. It's quite the interview for a director to give, coming across as a mixture of confrontational and arrogant, but also profoundly ambitious, and frankly giving out well-deserved criticism to an industry that was already starting to trend towards shameless mass appeal. If it had been anyone else, you might assume this to be the pride before the fall, but remember, this was a man who Hideo Kojima said could save the industry. And sitting behind his soaring ambition was a team of profoundly talented developers more than happy to follow him into battle. Once again, the ex-Quest team took on most of the major development roles, with Matsuno writing, directing,
I can't believe
designing,
he killed me.
Sakamoto composing
God
the music,
damn it.
and the duo of Minagawa and
Just
Yoshida
came right at me.
responsible for the
Makes
art
no
design
sense.
and graphical presentation.
Oh my God.
To augment this core team,
It's
both
okay, I'm
Yun
out of
Akiyama
supplies.
and Taru Murata,
I need to spend
who had
some
both
money
worked
now.
on Final Fantasy Tactics, were promoted to lead planner and lead programmer. And armed with a team of around 50 staff, development began in 1997 and wouldn't conclude for another 3 years. By 1990s video game standards, this was a monstrously long development cycle, and probably invites images of a messy and confused process. Rather surprisingly, the reality was quite the opposite, and each team made steady progress, working together in a cohesive manner, all under the eagle eye of Yasumi Matsuno. Interestingly, much of the process was documented in the Vagrant Story Ultimania guidebook, which Square published alongside the game's release in Japan. And thanks to the hard work of the guys at shmuplations.com, we English speakers can also peer into this world. Rather expectedly, the translation to 3D proved to be the biggest hurdle, especially as the team only had limited experience with modelling and animations. but oddly lead designer Hiroshi Minagawa considered this to be an advantage. He felt that the team's history with 2D development meant that they were really adept at being creative within restrictions, and so the whole process turned into this sort of puzzle where they constantly tried to find clever ways to resolve issues and achieve their goals. For example, Matsuno insisted that all character models needed to have multiple facial expressions, but very quickly Minagawa realised that this was simply impossible. By opting against pre-rendered backgrounds and going for fully 3D environments, they only had around 300 polygons per character to work with, and this meant no moving lips or eyes. Anyone else would have given up, but instead Minagawa's crew worked out an ingenious way of quickly loading
pattern for
different
logging
textures
clothing, nice.
to paint expressions onto the characters' faces. Obviously this had to be carefully lined up with cutscene direction, but the effect ended up looking far more stylish than if they'd gone the traditional route. Similarly, the team decided early on that they absolutely couldn't ship with lengthy load times, and so Taku Murata had to come up with a way of stitching the gameplay and cutscenes and effects together without causing masses of slowdown. Again, this would typically just be impossible, but instead of accepting defeat, he spent 3 entire years placing hundreds of tiny loads within the game, hidden away in room transitions or behind dialogue or taking place under short cutscenes. This method of hiding loading is something that's now standard practice, but for the late 90s, it was highly innovative and gives Vagrant Story a speed and flow that most other 90s RPGs can't even come close to matching. Rather sadly, this was hardly acknowledged in the game's reviews, and in his Ultimania interview, Taku Murata admits that had he known how little credit he would receive, he probably wouldn't have bothered and would have just stuck to traditional loading screens. Instead, all the magazine headlines were dominated by the writing and direction of Yasumi Matsuno, and while we'll dive into both of these aspects in far greater detail later in the video, they both had a big influence on how Vagrant Story was made. Firstly, it was decided almost immediately that the team would completely avoid using CGI cutscenes, and outside of a single promotional trailer, the entire story, from the moment you load the disc to the final scroll of the credits, takes place in-engine. For a Squaresoft PS1 game, this was virtually unheard of. They'd built their entire 3D reputation on their groundbreaking use of CGI, to the point where Sakaguchi was literally making an animated movie. So for Matsuno and co to break from this formula would have taken supreme confidence in an alternative. Well, to nobody's surprise, that was exactly what Matsuno believed he had. According to Yun Akiyama, they spent countless hours studying movies, closely watching how directors used camera angles, and then tried to apply these ideas to how they presented their own narrative. Rather than structuring the game around just a handful of eye-catching FMVs, Vagrant Story is instead littered with countless dialogue-driven scenes that took up almost as much development time as the actual gameplay. In order to facilitate all the sweeping camera work, every 3D model had to be visible from every angle, which took an enormous amount of time to build, and most curiously, Matsuno requested that the soundtrack progress in tandem with the player's progression through the dialogue. It meant that Sakamoto had to compose strange tracks that could loop in place, but would still augment the drama like a traditional film score. When you take all this into consideration, it's absolutely no surprise that the development cycle ended up taking as long as it did, and apparently it could have gone on even longer. Late in 1999, it became clear that they would need to release soon, or risk running out of console lifecycle, as the PlayStation 2 was due out in March 2000. This led to Matsuno's ambition finally having to be curbed, and everything that was remotely unfinished, like local multiplayer, AI-controlled companions, and a host of extra cutscenes, all had to be left behind as the team raced to hit its deadline. Well, they did indeed make it, although only by the skin of their teeth, as Vagrant Story released in Japan a mere 22 days before the release of Sony's next generation console. This could have easily overshadowed the team's hard work, but their game quickly made waves on both sides of the Pacific thanks to its extremely impressive critical reception. In the West, magazines like EGM, GamePro and Official PlayStation Magazine couldn't have been more positive, and this sentiment was shared by emerging influential websites, with IGN reviewer David Zadryko stating that it was not only one of the best games of the year, but one of the greatest games ever made. It was gushing praise, but the real jewel in Vagrant Story's review crown came from Japan. Back in the 1990s, the arbiter of all that was quality in the Japanese video game world was the magazine Famitsu and its notorious 40 scale mark. Now, they were miserly in the extreme, priding themselves on only handing out high scores to the best of the best. Seminal titles like A Link to the Past, Super Mario 64 and Tekken 3 all fell short with 39 out of 40, and huge blockbusters like Final Fantasy VII and Resident Evil could only manage a 38. In fact, by the year 2000, in the 14 years since Famitsu began, they had only handed out 2 perfect scores, one to Ocarina of Time in 1998, and another a year later to Soul Calibur on the Dreamcast. This infamous review austerity only made it all the more incredible when news emerged that they had awarded their 3rd ever perfect score to Vagrant Story, an accolade that sent reverberations around the world and made sure that the title would go down in history. It was impossible to see the release as anything other than a major triumph, and it seemed that Kojima's predictions about Matsuno had come true. He really had saved the industry by placing ambition and creativity above all else. This is why it's all the more shocking that just 5 years later, Yasumi Matsuno had not only left Square, but quit the video game industry altogether, and Vagrant Story, his cinematic masterpiece and Squaresoft's first Famitsu perfect score, had been entirely forgotten in the wake of a new generation. To understand how this could happen, we've got to dive into the game itself. Firstly, to see why its flame burnt so bright, and then to work out how it could flicker away within a matter of years. The clues to the fate of our creator lie within his creation. So guard yourself against the dark as we step into the dead city of Layamont, a world where memory, life and death bleed into one. From its very first moments, it's obvious that Vagrant Story is an RPG like none other, and Matsuno's unique approach to video game design makes for one of the most captivating opening sequences in the history of the medium. You see, Japanese role-playing games in the 1990s were typically slow starters, and thanks to the long run times and focus on extensive world building, most directors liked to take their time, easing players in with sleepy rural villages and menial chores. By the year 2000, this structure was essentially genre doctrine, and things had started to get out of hand, with the average runtime of a console RPG massively increasing, and taking with it the amount of time it took to get to the good stuff. The poster child for this was Dragon Quest VII, a truly gigantic game that asked the player to sit through almost 5 hours before the very first fight. And it was this trend that Matsuno was looking to buck when directing the opening of Vagrant Story.
Outrageous.
Rather than taking cues from other video games, he turned to the world of cinema and put together a series of scenes that have more in common with Mission Impossible than Secret of Mana, immediately catching your attention and drawing you into a world of conspiracy, betrayal, and mystery. When you select a new game, the very first image you see is the stately home of Duke Bardorba, burning against the night sky. Clearly we're headed straight into the action, and the very next scene is a beautiful sequence of shots which frame a blonde knight drawing his sword from a corpse and then staring out across the burning citadel while a soldier makes a panicked report. Despite the fires that threaten to engulf the manor, the blonde knight is far more concerned with the location of one Sydney. And with just a single name, Vagrant Story's atmosphere of mystery is established. Who are these characters? What's happening within the manor? And most importantly, who is Sydney? While this initial narrative hook is beautifully simple, the graphical presentation is anything but, and those hours spent studying camera work and perfecting the models have clearly paid off. In this short scene alone, we have texture work that simulates shadows, clever camera angles that show the manor burning without the need for complex animations, and some of the most gorgeous text bubbles that I've ever seen. It inarguably looks and sounds premium, and that's also found in how the credits are woven into this sequence. Not only does it work as an effective scene transition, but seeing the developers' names positioned so prominently gives everything a real sense of gravity, almost like you're watching a summer blockbuster rather than playing a PlayStation 1 RPG. So with the next screen wipe, we're taken to the manor's courtyard, and as rain begins to fall, a lone man stares up at the burning building. This is Ashley Riot, Vagrant Story's protagonist, although just like with the Blonde Knight, we're offered little clue as to who he is and why he's here. Really, you'd only know he's the main character thanks to his prominence on the game's cover. Once inside, he hides away and watches as the interlopers decide to kill their hostages, which prompts the camera to pull back and for Vagrant Story, the video game, to suddenly roar into life. Now functionally this is nothing more than a basic battle to introduce the player to the game's mechanics, but its place in this opening sequence makes it feel far more consequential than the average tutorial. And not just learning how to attack and defend, but preventing the deaths of the hostages. A beautiful marriage of the interactivity of video games and the immersion of cinema. With our victory comes another scene change. Ashley is now inside of the manor, where he's located the perpetrator, the aforementioned Sydney, who's currently embroiled in an argument with his second in command, Hardin. Once again, the presentation is just leagues beyond what you'd expect from a 5th generation title. Instead of immediately showing Sydney, the scene slowly builds to his reveal, focusing on Ashley's reactions while he eavesdrops, and even obscuring the villain's face when the camera does move inside the throne room. When we finally do see Sydney, one question is answered, but another is posed. How has such a diminutive and slender man, wearing no armour and carrying no weapons, caused all the chaos raging within the manor, and why are his subordinates so terrified of his wrath? Again, the credits cut across the scene and we jump forwards in time. Ashley has burst into the room and holds Sydney at gunpoint, demanding he stand down and submit to being captured. It's a standoff that lasts mere minutes, as without warning, Sydney rushes at Ashley, only to be shot through the heart. The soldier then stands over his quarry, confirming his kill, but is interrupted by Hardin returning with a young hostage, which proves to be just enough of a distraction for Ashley to be caught in the back of the head by none other than Sydney. He again stands tall, but this time with a bolt protruding from his chest, and in what is clearly meant to be wheezing and broken speech, he orders Hardin to take the boy to Alldayerrydaybaby. Ashley can't believe what's happening and demands answers, but as Sydney pulls the arrow from his body, all he offers is this fantastic line: "Show a little more respect for fairy tales, Riskbreaker." With that, he calls down a wyvern who smashes through the ceiling to stand in Ashley's way, and whether he be a demon or magician or mere mortal, the wounded Sydney escapes out of a stained glass window and leaves the Riskbreaker to his fate. This leads into a second section of gameplay where we battle with the lizard and are introduced to some further mechanics, but really this fight is meant to provide a narrative climax. The boss fight might be a design trope as old as time, but it's certainly effective at giving a sequence closure, and it rounds out the introduction with a moment of victory, a taste of success that beckons the player into the rest of the game. When the beast is felled, Ashley heads up to the smashed window, but there's no sign of Sydney, only the smoking remains of the Duke's estate, bathed in the morning glow of the rising sun. Our final line of dialogue is the mystery at the heart of Vagrant Story, a name and a question. Alldayerrydaybaby.
Docking request accepted.
What did Sydney mean by Alldayerrydaybaby? With that, the camera pulls back inside the throne room, and as the music swells and the lens flare frames our hero looking out across the horizon, the screen cuts to the title, and Vagrant Story begins. The whole sequence is a mere 10 minutes long, establishing its characters, gameplay, central plot and cinematic style with such masterful skill that you can hardly believe this was the team's first foray into the world of 3D development. I honestly believe that if you consider the hardware being used and the state of video game storytelling when it was created, this is probably the greatest introductory sequence ever put to disc. And if you aren't desperate to discover what happens next, well, I simply think storytelling isn't for you. Now, before we dive into the game proper, we have to discuss the first of what will be many strange design choices. There's actually a lot more to Vagrant Story's introduction than this exciting piece of video game cinema. For some reason, there is a very important additional context contained within 2 other cutscenes, but if you just start a new game, you'll never see them. That is because they will only play if you set the controller down and just wait on the main menu. Eventually the game's CGI trailer will begin, and then after another 30-second wait, you're shown an abridged version of the events at Duke Bardorba's manor, but this time with a police report spliced in between its scenes, and this reveals